Okay, we're live and good to go.
All right, good evening, everybody. We're going to go ahead and call the November meeting of the Alexandria Transit Company Board of Directors to order. It is nice to see everybody again and to be able to participate virtually. We always start our meetings with a public comment period. So if there are any members of the public who are here that wish to be heard, I'm going to ask staff whether we had anybody who has signed up in advance, but if not, we'll allow a short time for anyone in the chat to indicate that they wish to be heard. Has anyone registered in advance?
We do not have any advance registrations, David.
All right, we'll wait about 30 more seconds to see if anyone else wishes to be heard.
Chairman, it looks like we do have a comment from a member of the public, Jim Suits, who thought he registered in advance. There's a chat there in the chat box.
I'm sorry, Larry, I was having a hard time hearing you. You said there's a comment in the chat.
There is. Jim Suits wishes to make a comment.
Yeah, we'll just hold on one second, Mr. Chairman. Caitlin, if you would promote Jim Suits to speak, that'd be great.
I think she has. Can you hear me?
Oh, yep, there you go.
Excellent. So good afternoon, and thanks for giving me a couple minutes of your time. I do want to apologize if I sound a little mumbly because I did just come from the dentist a couple hours ago, so I can't feel half of my face.
So, Mr. Seuss, just before you go on with your comments, I haven't started your clock yet, but I'm going to give you, I'm going to interrupt you at 2 minutes, 30 seconds to give you a verbal warning that you're approaching 3 minutes, and then at 3 minutes, I'll let you know to please wrap up.
Understood.
Okay, I'm going to start your clock now.
Sure. So I just wanted to start, although it's not directly germane to the topic, I wanted to raise to commend Dash's resilience through the past months. I think Dash has been among the most responsive and transparent organizations of any kind, never mind of transit agencies. And I think it sets a standard to which I could only dream that certain other regional transit providers would attempt to aspire. With that said, I wanted to take a minute to highlight and reinforce one of the things that certain other regional transit providers are proposing to do. So at last month's meeting, you discussed the proposed WMATA bus discontinuations, and it's item 4C on today's agenda as well. So back before the COVID times, I was a daily commuter on WMATA bus 21A and some others. And so I have to say, from my experience there, it is no surprise that Metro would use this situation as a means to eliminate bus services that it has never really cared about. When I rode the 21A, there were multiple missed trips every week. Metro could not even be bothered to acknowledge, let alone address those missed trips. It got to a point where I had to go into work 15 or even 30 minutes early every day because I simply could not rely on that bus to show up in the first place. So the discussion you had last month centered on the additional cost to commuters if these cuts would take effect, but I really want to highlight the impact of the time that it would take. So on Wednesday, March 4th, which was the last day that I commuted normally, it took me 45 minutes door to door to get from my condo in the West End to my office in Washington, D.C., using buses 21A and 16C. And it's worth noting that the 16C segment that extends into D.C. is also proposed for elimination. And it was a common connection point for riders of the 21 and 8 buses. If these services are eliminated, my commute will increase 20 minutes each way, which is an additional 3.5 hours per week, which is basically an entire week per year of extra time spent commuting. So with that said, I understand that the current context does not support full service. I've only gone to my office twice since March. I don't anticipate that's going to change anytime soon for at least 4 to 6 months. But at that end, I want to suggest that Dash consider this to
At
be
30 seconds, Mr. Suits.
perfect. I want to suggest that Dash consider this to be an opportunity, not only to retain ridership service, but to enhance it. So there are a couple of things that you could do to keep the services running, up to and including taking them over directly. Now, I recognize that today is not the day to add service. But looking ahead, if Metro intends to withdraw from this sector, and every indication would lead me to believe that they do, I feel compelled on behalf of myself and my fellow riders to implore Dash to fill that void, possibly in a way that doesn't just restore, but improves on the services available. So thank you again for your time and consideration, and I wish you all a pleasant week.
Thank you, Mr. Suits. And I would assume you've been in touch with City Council about this as well.
Yeah.
And the WMATA board.
Yeah, the WMATA is useless. They ignore comments. But yes, I've been in touch with anyone who will listen.
There are restrictions that exist on our ability to operate service outside of the city of Alexandria, in terms of just how the WMATA compact was set up to govern bus service that is regional in nature. However, everything is subject to negotiation, and we find ourselves in extraordinary time. But it would, under the current conditions, we would not be able to assume that service without changes to the compact. But I would also encourage you to continue to be in touch, not with our elected officials, but with our planners here at Dash, and our Director of Planning and Scheduling, Martin Barna, is on the call. And if we have your information, would encourage if the two of you want to have a further conversation and see, as changes that Dash are making that may be helpful to your neighborhood in serving your commute, because that's what we're trying to do amidst very difficult resources. But I want to thank you for coming forward and for staying engaged about service that you care about. And we sent that letter because we were concerned as well about the equity issues and both the additional cost and the additional time of that providing that of losing that service. So I thank you very much.
All right, thank you all.
Do we have additional speakers?
It doesn't appear so, Mr. Chairman. There is a comment in the chat thanking us for services that we're providing, and
Great.
Doesn't appear
All
to
right,
be.
well, that's always good to hear. Thank you. So we'll go ahead and close the public comment period and move on to approval of the October meeting minutes, which were included in our packet. Are there any changes, revisions to the minutes? And if not, I would entertain a motion.
Mr. Chair, I move that the minutes from our October meeting be approved.
All right, moved by Matt.
Second.
Okay, I'm not sure who got in first.
Jeff did it.
Oh, Jeff. Okay. Hi. So seconded by Jeff. All in favor? Say aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right. Unanimous. Thank you. Item number 3 are board member announcements, reports, and business items. So I'll go ahead with the chair's report. Two items to report on. One is the very successful electric bus unveiling that we had here in Alexandria last month. It was a very, very, very proud day to welcome the governor and the Secretary of Transportation and many of our other local elected officials and folks from, I believe, NVTA and NDTC were there as well. Excuse me, let me turn off my phone. We had a great day and wonderful speeches. It was so heartening to hear the governor and the Secretary of Transportation talk about the importance of mass transit, because we're going to be getting into some agenda items later on. We're going to be looking at potentially having to make some changes to our network in recognition of the city's financial state, but to understand that we have elected officials who are so supportive and understanding of the role that transit plays in our economy and as a necessity to mobility here in this area. I want to again thank the staff who are responsible for putting on this event, and it really was lovely. And I'm glad that so many of you were able to participate as well. And hopefully you've had a chance to look at the website that Josh mentioned in his report, which has some really great pictures of the event. But it was a lot of fun. Our second item is some sadder news. I was told over the weekend that we're going to be losing one of our board members, and I was very sad to hear that, and I'm going to put her on the spot for just a moment. Lisa Henty has accepted a position with Fauquier County as their budget director, and so will be leaving the city on December 1st. And so, although we've only had her with us for a few months, we have had a great working relationship with her even long before she joined the board. She has been a primary contact in OMB for us. Our professional staff has so enjoyed working with her. She has contributed a lot to the board as well, and we were looking forward to having a closer association with OMB, which makes a lot of sense given our importance as a city service, and one that receives a lot of funding from the city. And so, Lisa, I just want to tell you how much we're going to miss you, and we congratulate you, and we wish you all the best in your new position. I
Thank
certainly
you so
will.
much.
If you'd like to say anything more?
I mean, I would simply say it's been a privilege. I haven't had the opportunity to work with transit directly, moving up through my career in budget until I came to the city of Alexandria. And we certainly have our own unique situation, both regionally, but also with Dash. So it has been a very rewarding experience for me, and I wish everybody all the best of luck.
Thank you. We wish you the best as well. And I also want to commend you because, when we get city staff members who aren't from the TNES side or aren't from the planning side and really express an interest in being part of our board, I think that speaks very well to you and wanting to become better acquainted with this city service and to be part of frankly, making it better. So we thank you and we wish you good luck. I'll go ahead and turn it over to Hillary for the TNES report.
Okay, great. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Nice to see you all. Can everybody hear me? Is my mic working okay?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay, great. So I'm just going to go over some of the notes that you received earlier in the week and stop me at any time with questions, or we can follow up at the end. Some of these are similar to last month and just ongoing updates. So I'm going to skim through those. But the Potomac Yard Metro Station construction is moving forward. And the important thing to note here is that the amendment for the South Access Pavilion will be presented to Planning Commission and City Council this month. The NBTC Commuter Choice Program, the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission approved the solicitation of projects on November 5th. So we will be bringing to you all at the December board meeting staff's request for that funding. This is a biennial grant cycle, so it's $30 million over 2 years for the region. So we'll be coming back and having a discussion with you all on what the city and Dash will be requesting for that funding application and looking for your endorsement next month. The electric vehicle infrastructure readiness strategy, we've talked about this a little bit, but there was a presentation to the Transportation Commission on October 21st, and this is really about deploying electric vehicle charging infrastructure in the city, looking at our needs, looking for where we could put in publicly accessible charging infrastructure, different options, and then also looking at city processes, our codes, our zoning ordinances, our permitting, and seeing how that fits in with electric vehicles becoming more popular and prevalent in the city. And then also recommending some policies and approaches and synergies for how we can better manage this. Just noting that the city is receiving comments through November 13th. So that's Friday. So if you haven't made comments and want to weigh in, there is the link in the email that I sent to you all. We also provided some updates pulling from some of the transportation impacts of COVID around the region. Some of the ones that kind of jumped out at me were that truck traffic is back to pre-COVID levels. I think we're seeing certainly more deliveries as people are doing more online ordering. It's certainly from the transportation side, we are hearing about more truck traffic in the city, but I think it's just a bigger percentage of the vehicles that are out there. WMATA has said that they've seen gradual recovery of metro ridership. It's going, bus ridership is actually increasing faster than rail ridership between, I think we're looking between July and September. VRE service though has not yet increased. And then the other thing that I found particularly interesting was that looking at employers who are coming up with a returning to work plan, that 20% of the workforce could be teleworking full-time, which certainly impacts the travel that we're seeing on our roadways during the peak hours. You know, could lead to decreased congestion, but could also lead to more people driving and shifting from transit. So these are things that we're all thinking about, both on the T&ES city side and with Dash. Let's see. Okay, so the WMATA board formally voted in October on hearing docket for their amendment to close their fiscal year 21 very large $210 million budget gap. I think we talked about this some last month, but the cut they approved are likely going to become more of a baseline. So that's something that we need to think about, you know, and we are thinking about for FY22. But the city and Dash did submit letters to WMATA during the comment period about options to provide more service on the 8Z and the 21A. Let's see what's next. In actually both September and October, the Transportation Commission discussed the Transportation Long Range Plan, and that we look at every 2 years, the LRP, where we put all of our unfunded capital projects and studies kind of onto one list, and the Transportation Commission uses criteria to prioritize those projects. These are projects that come from small area plans or other planning studies, and they don't have any funding attached to them. So once they get funding, they come off this list. But city staff use this list when grants are available, or we're looking to move projects into the city's CIP. You know, we look at when a grant's available, what it's looking for, what the criteria is, and then determine if any of the projects on the list, starting with the highest priority and going down, fit the criteria and would be good candidates for that process. They will be discussing it again in November, and there will be a public hearing likely with a final adoption in December on that plan. Okay, so the city budget update, I know we'll talk more about this later in the meeting, but the city council held their annual budget retreat this past Saturday, and this is where the city manager's budget goals and council budget goals were discussed. And I think the key thing to note here is that for FY22, we have a $41 million budget gap on the city side that we need to close. So we do have, you know, the city manager's priorities, but they did note that this gap does reflect increases in the subsidy to Dash and WMATA, but it does not reflect any further increases to transit. So still looking at our current service levels and but reflecting the increased cost from the CBA and cost for on the operating side of Dash. And we can talk more about this when we start getting into the budget and the financials a little bit later in the meeting. And Lisa can certainly weigh in on that. Lastly, I just wanted to note that the city has 4 recovery teams for COVID-19, and I participated on the human service recovery and recovery team, and just wanted to highlight this for you all because it's been a really interesting process working on this particular recovery team. This is a team that set forth to identify and provide resources and support to programs, systems, policies, and initiatives that are really focused on the city's most vulnerable populations who have been impacted by COVID-19. So the plan looked at 4 key areas, and one of those areas was transportation. We know that transportation definitely impacts, and specifically transit, a lot of our more vulnerable population. And the highest prioritized transportation recommendation in this plan was to advance the ATV 2022 bus network and increase frequency of bus service, really focused on ridership needs for these particular populations. So there was a presentation to council last night, and there's more details in the notes if you want to see the plan. The full plan was on the council docket. It also focused on, or some of the other recommendations included looking at our low income fare policy study, which we've talked about, and expanding bike share to underserved communities, as well as increasing transit ridership back to pre-COVID levels. I'm happy to take any questions.
Hillary, I have one for you about the last item, the human services plan. So understanding, we're going to be getting into some pretty dire budget forecasting shortly. So how does the manager and council anticipate using the human services plan as they make budget decisions, and understanding that, their top transportation goal is a really huge increase to the budget if they were in fact to go ahead with it?
Right. I mean, I think the key kind of cornerstone of this plan is equity, which is a big focus area for the city this year, even with our budget gap. So I think they're going to be looking to this plan. There are a lot of recommendations in here that are really, really important for the community in human services side of things for folks. So while the advancing the ATV was the highest priority transportation initiative, there's a lot of other priorities that they're going to have to balance within this plan. But the goal was to bring together an interdepartmental team that at least highlighted the things that from these 4 focus areas we thought in terms of equity and recovery were the most important. And then council and the city manager are going to have to kind of balance those and determine which ones need funding. In our plan, the ATV was actually the only thing that transportation element that was not fully funded. So that was good. We have funding for a lot of the other transportation initiatives, but with all budget, it's going to be a balance.
Okay. Other questions for Hillary?
The only thing I would add to that, Hillary, is just they did approve last night the flexibility for a tax rate increase in the budget guidance resolution. They had a 30-ish minute debate about that. So there was portions of council who posed the question of not raising taxes at all. So the city manager has at least the flexibility to do so in a responsible manner. But I will also echo what Hillary said from the beginning of our budget projections this year. City Manager Jinks has said that there will, in some ways, we may need to reallocate from other services to make sure our priority areas are funded. We can't ignore some crucial areas and services in the city this year, despite our significant budget gap. So.
Thank you. Other questions for Hillary? Okay, if not, thank you, Hillary, for your report. At this point, I would open this up for any other announcements or items that board members want to bring forward, either from boards and other boards and commissions and associations that you're part of, or if you have any other announcements to make. Matt?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Good evening, everyone. My employer has designated me to deal with the Biden administration's transition team and finding applicants to serve in the area of transit. Well, obviously they're not guaranteed jobs. If you all know of people of interest who serve and want to serve and are, people who obviously are pro-transit like we all are, I'd encourage them to give me a resume, and sort of look through the plum book and figure out what types of positions they may want to seek. Obviously, it's no guarantee, but the better folks, the pro-transit people we can find, the better. So anyway, thank you, Dave.
Thank you, Matt. Other updates or announcements? All right, we will go ahead and move on to the general manager's report. So I'll turn this over to Josh.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. It's good to see you all again this evening as we continue to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. Before I get into my report, I was able to ask for a special guest to join us this evening and speak for a few minutes to you for primarily the purpose of introductions, but also to provide some insight as to the environment that we're dealing with on a state and federal level related to transit funding. So I don't want to spend a lot of time introducing her, except to say that Kate Mattice, many of you may already know, some of you may not, is a great friend and colleague of mine who I work very closely with in regards to projects both locally and statewide. Kate and I both serve on the Virginia Transit Association board, and Kate is the executive director of the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission. As you'll see there on the screen, she leads the coordination of transit investments across our region. As the voice of public transit in Northern Virginia, NVTC brings the region together to plan, coordinate, and secure funding for the transit systems that are financially sustainable and high performing. So I'm looking forward to giving you the opportunity just to hear a little bit from Kate. We were on a call earlier in the week, or last week, I guess it was. They all blend together to me. And one of the things I mentioned to Kate was, it's often hard for us to understand where we need to put our advocacy as it relates to transit funding and bills and potentially things that might serve to help bridge the gap that we're dealing with in our fiscal outlook. And so I rely quite heavily on a personal level on Kate to help me to understand what the different moving pieces are there. And so if she has something to share with us this evening regarding those, she certainly can and will. But the primary purpose is an introduction and certainly any Q&A. So I will turn it over to Kate. I know that she's on here. You confirmed earlier. If you want to.
I am.
Go ahead and jump in.
Well, good evening, everyone. And Josh, thank you so much for that introduction. And I mean, I think you've just introduced me very well on the screen, but I may say some things a little repetition because I know there's a lot of acronyms of organizations up here in Northern Virginia. So just to give a little bit of background, the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission, we are really the regional transit commission for Northern Virginia. And so we truly are the only regional body that's 100% focused on public transportation and really the health of public transportation here in Northern Virginia. And so our primary mission, as Josh mentioned, is really to support our local transit providers. We have a very strong relationship and decades experience with WMATA, and I know I heard obviously some comments that you had earlier about that. So we at NVTC are the managers of state and regional funding for WMATA on behalf of all our jurisdictions, including, of course, the city of Alexandria. We are the co-owners of the Virginia Railway Express. We do that jointly with PRTC, our commission to the south. And it was great, Hillary mentioning one of our more recent additional programs, which is the Commuter Choice Program, where we're proud to have a partnership for many decades to come with the Commonwealth to be funding transit that serves the express lanes, including 395 and 95. And I know we've been able to fund a couple dash routes in the past, and I'm excited to look and see which you guys are thinking about for the future. So indeed, that call for projects is open right now. But another thing that we do, and this is really where Josh was getting at, is I work with Josh and his colleagues throughout the region to really focus on opportunities and honestly challenges with the myriad of funding that's used by our localities in funding transit. And so, as you know, all of our systems, Some dip into the federal pool, some, obviously rely heavily on DRPT and state funding. You have your own revenue sources or come from the localities as well as fare boxes. So a big part of what I do and my staff do is really help our regional transit operators navigate those very complicated places. And so, fortunately, both me and my staff, we have fantastic relationships with the state. And I actually have a long history of working with the Federal Transit Administration. At the federal level, I was actually there for 13 years before I came to NVTC. So getting to know the players both in Congress as well as at FTA has been really, really important to help all of our folks, including, of course, VRE and WMATA, navigate those federal space as well. So yes, these are really trying times right now. The economic impact of the pandemic that is hitting directly on city budgets, on county budgets, on state budgets, on federal budgets is definitely something that we're paying very, very close attention to. Watching the trends, Hillary talked a lot about those. We're doing the same thing, trying to understand back to work surveys, what's sort of happening. Obviously, I think all of us are very mindful of the resurgence of COVID. So we're going to see sort of how that plays. Also sort of the decisions of schools. A lot of people's travel patterns do relate to what they're, if they have needs at home for caring for children, as well as then the general need and desire to have that essential service, especially our bus transit in the region is providing and making sure that's there. So we're tracking all of that. As Josh had mentioned, the federal government, or the stuff that we're probably most concerned in watching right now, is actually in the federal space. We have had, Northern Virginia's actually had incredible amount of support with the state, with DRPT. They were able to pivot very quickly and provide additional operating funding to all of our transit operators earlier this year. The omnibus bill that was passed by the General Assembly earlier this year really provided some very good structure for future revenue growth that's going to help all of our local transit providers. But on sort of the bigger macro level, and this is really almost more directly related to the city of Alexandria's budget insofar that they're supporting WMATA, is there is a great deal of need and attention for our major transit agencies who are federal recipients, including WMATA, to see a second round of stimulus. And so that is really where our eyes are on right now, working very closely with WMATA, with the national transit agents associations like the American Public Transportation Association and CTAA and others, to really focus and get the attention of Congress on a second stimulus package or relief package, and making sure that includes transit. I cannot say that's going to be easy, but that is something that we have our eyes on. So I may have already talked too much. I'm going to pause here, take questions. Hopefully, Josh, this is what you were looking for me to provide, but I'm happy to answer your questions, but I do not have a crystal ball. I will put that out there. I wish I did.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead, Mr. Chairman.
Well, I'll go ahead and ask the question about, so I appreciate you don't have a crystal ball. You can't tell us what's going to happen, but what are you hearing now that we have a sense of, who's going to, which party will control the White House, and that will have then divided control with the Congress? Has there been any change in terms of what you're hearing from your sources on the Hill about what, whether a bill would be done this year and what, and the prospects for transit?
So the prospects for transit are stronger because you have a very transit supportive Biden administration coming in. Part of their blueprint for climate change that's out there is transit's right front and center. And if anybody, of course, knows the president-elect and his history, he's a huge Amtrak fan. So I think we're very well served by this administration when it comes to public transit. We're also very well served with the composition of the House. They actually had included transit in some of their earlier passages. The big unknown, and that's actually still unknown because of some of the uncertainties with Georgia, is the Senate. Transit funding is actually in the banking committee of the Senate, and that has some potential leadership changes. So it's sort of a little bit of a moving target. I think people are trying to understand where everything's shaking out. But I believe it's still a very challenging place to be, and that's where our focus is on the U.S. Senate. I do need to say, absolutely, our Virginia, in fact, the delegation from throughout the Washington, D.C. region are incredibly supportive for this. The challenge is they're not in the, especially for our senators, they're not in the majority, and that puts them in a difficult spot. Senator Warner, however, does sit on the Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee, which is where transit action will happen if there's funding on it.
Thanks, Kate. Other questions? And I don't have the gallery view, so if you want to, so I can't see if anyone's raising their hand, so you can just go ahead and start talking if you have a question.
I was just looking, Mr. Chairman. I wasn't seeing any, but feel free to interrupt me. I would just say again, thank you to Kate. And I wanted to say to the board members, you know, I've heard from you anecdotally over the past couple of months about the interest of having individuals such as Kate join us to kind of brief us on what's going on. And so you get to be the first, Kate, and I would certainly welcome board member feedback as to how we can further facilitate this as a part of the portion of my report. But I will say, in talking with Kate prior to this meeting about the goal here is the introduction, and I'm hopeful that you will come back to us if and when you see an opportunity where we need to get something we need to get behind to support. And certainly Kate and I are on a text message basis, so she sends me a note and says, hey, there's something going on, we got to act on it quick, and I will. Myself and my team will act on it quickly, and we will certainly, if it's in between board meetings, alert you all by way of the chairman of the necessity to get behind something. But this is certainly going to be a challenging time, and so having partners like Kate out there helping us to understand how to navigate the rocky waters is helpful. So,
well, again, I really appreciate the opportunity, and the partnership we have with Dash and with the city is really a big part of what helps the strength of NVTC. So I can come back anytime. Best of luck on the rest of your meeting.
thank you again.
Thank you.
All right, I'll continue with the rest of my report. It's relatively brief. Of course, we continue to operate in this pandemic in the same mode that we had been operating in previously. You can see here on the screen, our ridership continues to gradually increase. We're still maintaining service that's ahead of that demand, and we're monitoring closely crowding. We recently had a town hall with the workforce. In fact, that was just, what's today, Wednesday? So that was just yesterday. And there were some questions that came through from our workforce about how to handle any potential crowding. And we were able to talk a little bit about our stage buses and how we continue to do the things that we started with, which have turned out to be quite effective, which includes providing masks, requiring masks, having stage buses available to come in if a driver starts to find their bus is filling up, and to stay ahead of things. We did get a little bit of feedback that there are some challenging passengers regarding mask usage and how to manage that. Of course, we encourage no confrontation. We've seen across the country where confrontation can become problematic, but we're supporting our workforce in any way possible within the limitations of the law. But we're continuing to move forward also with our plans to install our driver barriers. The word is that they are on track right now. And if they do come in from the vendor in a reasonable time frame, our team internally will be installing those on the buses and retrofitting them. And so we'll hopefully have control over that. Of course, it will come up against the holidays, but I will keep you all informed in the December meeting as to the status of that and any delays that we might encounter that we'll have to deal with come January. Speaking of that, I wanted to let you all know that my intent, I've been working with my team, is to solicit and survey from our riders today, the people who are riding the bus now, not the ones who have previously or might ride the bus, but actually people who are on the bus, to get a sense of their position, of the importance of reduced or eliminating fares for a longer period of time, or the importance of maintaining as much service as possible in the coming fiscal year? Very simple question. Certainly the opinions and answers can be somewhat complex, but with safety in mind and making sure that we're doing this in a way that does not put anyone at risk, but does directly speak to the riders, not via an electronic survey that comes in an email that, we'd love to hear from everyone, but right now we'd really like to be able to come back to you in December. And even if we can only tell you what 50 people said, I feel like those 50 people are the people that are stepping foot off our bus. And it tells me that they're the ones who really need to ride Dash right now. So I want to make sure that I'm providing you all with as much information as possible as it relates to the forthcoming decision as to the exact re-implementation of fare collection. So I don't have a lot more details on that, but I just did want to let you know that we won't go into the December meeting without having accomplished that level of outreach. And although the sample may be small, we want to make sure that the sample is a very direct sample for you.
Hey, Josh.
Sure, go ahead.
Is that a mutually exclusive either or fares or service? And if so, how would they be able to judge to the extent of cuts in service?
Sure. I mean, that's a good point. I think that it's more of a philosophical question, and we're really trying to get at the question of how much are they struggling financially right now as to what the impact would be of them in their ability to live and put food on the table. If they're struggling to the point where they have to ride Dash every day and the fares that are associated with that would put them over budget and unable to sustain their lives, that's really what I want to get at here. Certainly where the service is reduced potentially, or where we might have to make cuts in the future, is still unknown, but we have some certainty around that. So we would certainly make sure we have the ability to at least say generally, these are the areas we're thinking. But also the other point here is that we would want to help them understand that, nothing is very, very certain come July, right? Or even before then. But in regards to what's going on right at this moment, what's your position? And we're hopeful, and Martin does have a little bit of feedback on that. He's gonna actually show us some survey results later. This was a survey that was sent out, more traditional means. But I just felt like, this is very important to me, that when we're considering a decision like this, we at least in some way have heard very, very directly from people. And we recognize and respect the feedback that others have already given us. And I think that it's probably fully accurate, but we just want to really test that even more. Anybody else has questions, feel free to interrupt me.
And I would say, Josh and I had a conversation about this last week, and I had shared with him, one of the things we have always struggled with, how to get feedback from all of our riders, particularly those who are either less able to attend meetings back when we were having in-person meetings and feedback sessions, as well as through online surveys. And so, I think it makes sense that we do this, and Josh is confident that it can be done in a way that is going to be safe for his staff. I mean, it's useful. It's a data point to have and to consider. And so I commend him for trying to be creative during this time to ensure that, we're hearing from everybody. So when we do make a decision, we can say, we really tried very hard to do outreach throughout our community.
Thank you, exactly. So Mr. Chairman, I'll move on here in my report and just say that included in your packet this month was a copy of the final letter that was submitted to WMATA in regards to their proposed service cuts. Of course, the gentleman spoke at the beginning of this meeting, the public comment. We appreciate his comment as well as any others that we receive. Certainly are incorporating them into our discussions on a staff level with WMATA, but wanted to make sure that that information was documented and in your hand so that you could see what actually went in. And that was submitted via the electronic submittal portal that WMATA set up for this feedback. The last item that I have on my report, our chairman mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, and that was that we had the unveiling of our electric buses. And I want to echo his comments that it was a great day. The weather was gorgeous, which was a great sign. When I woke up in the morning and saw that it wasn't pouring rain out, which it seems to do for every other event. And we were so pleased that the governor and the secretary, the mayor, members of council, and some of you were able to join. It's very, very hard to pull off an event like this and manage it in a way that is safe for everyone and does not encourage congregating. We certainly recognize the environment we're operating in, but this is just such an exciting and thrilling thing for us. And it's such an important project for our community. I'm pleased with how everyone adhered to our mask requirements and ultimately the outcomes of the event. And I want to personally thank the staff, all of the staff who put a lot of effort into putting that together once again. I want to encourage you to go to our Dash Bus YouTube channel. Just go on YouTube and search Dash Bus. We have an official channel. I will also give a shout out to all of our Dash fans because there are a lot of other videos up there that Dash has not done, but they are supporters and riders and people who've been out using our service from across the country and have posted videos as well. We're very, very proud and appreciate the support. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll pause to make sure there are no additional questions, and then I'm going to attempt to hand control of the PowerPoint over to Evan Davis, who will continue the rest of this meeting. So Evan, it looks like you're moving the mouse, so I'll let you have at it.
Thank you, Josh. Good evening, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. My presentation tonight really focuses first on where we are in fiscal 21 for our first quarter of operations, and then continues, of course, into the budget. And those of you who were here last month, a lot of what I have to say tonight is essentially the situation's unchanged and our budget proposal is unchanged from last month. So I'll stay pretty high level. As always, feel free to stop me at any point if you'd like to drill down a little deeper into any of the details that are in the report. So after 3 months, after our first quarter, we are showing in the books and on paper a year-to-date deficit of about $666,000. And again, that's really just being caused by two reasons. One of which is the CARES Act, which is covering the fact that we're not collecting any passenger revenue. We have not yet made the transfers to transfer that revenue filling funding into our budget. That's just contingent on that money actually being approved through the budget office and appropriations process, which is in progress, and we're going to do that. And then, actually, I'm going to move that back there. And then the other piece is that we still have to move over the costs which are being funded by the I-395 commuter choice grants for the AT1 Plus and the AT9. Again, that just needs to go through the appropriations process with the city, and that will be happening over the next couple of months. Once that happens, we will be in a surplus situation for fiscal 21, and we expect that really to continue throughout the year to track variously. And as we get towards the end of the year, what we're going to do is only transfer the amount of CARES Act funds that are needed to make Dash whole in this fiscal year. We are running, as you know, a reduced service pattern, and particularly the King Street trolley is not operating right now. And those two things, along with very low fuel costs, are enabling us to run under budget on expenditures, and we expect that to be the case for as long as we are running a reduced service pattern. I'm going to see if I can take this back a couple slides. It got ahead here.
Sorry, Evan, that might have been me.
I don't seem to have control of it at the moment.
Let's try it again. I'll give it back to you and then I'll stop touching my screen.
All right.
There you go.
But as we look for the rest of fiscal 21, in your packet, of course, there's information about some specific monthly lines, none of which are really, a major concern that we need to address, but I'm happy to answer any questions. As I said, the CARES Act funding is not only covering our revenue losses, it's also covering the expenditures that we are going to be doing to maintain safety and responding to the COVID pandemic throughout the fleet and the facility, namely the enhanced cleaning that we're doing in the facility, as well as installing the bus operator safety barriers and some facility modifications for social distancing. We are expecting, as Josh said, the delivery of those barriers in December, and then our maintenance team is going to work really hard to get those installed as quickly as possible, keeping in mind that the holidays will be a bit of a break for some of our staff, of course. So hopefully those installations should be done at some point in January. And of course, that will be, part of the decision before the board next month as to when or if to reinstate fare collection. That's really what I would share for fiscal 21. Are there any questions at this point from the board?
Yeah, just one question, Evan. Do you anticipate your fuel expenses will go down with the addition of the electric buses, or are there not enough buses online by fiscal budget 21?
Yeah, the 3 buses that we have now and 3 more in January, they're not going to make probably a meaningful impact in this fiscal year. Actually just today, we awarded our zero emission bus implementation study to the contractor. They're going to get started within the next week or so. And that's one of the questions they're going to help us answer eventually is what is the cost difference between buying diesel fuel, obviously, versus the electricity increase that we're going to have over the long term. And then how do we budget for that year over year on an operating basis? So that we'll be looking at it. Josh, I still can't get the slides to go back here, but I can just, if there are no other questions on fiscal 21.
A question,
Yes, sir.
Evan. Okay, go back to the, I'm sorry to make you go back to the other slide, but it's regarding the WMATA estimate, 50% pre-COVID. I'm wondering if that estimate considers the fact that there may be a resurgence of the COVID. They may have estimated that based on the trend that we were seeing in the months coming up towards the end of summer. But I'm wondering, does that estimate include what we are seeing in the near future?
Thank you for that question. So this is our estimate for fiscal 22, starting in July, right? And what WMATA is looking at is anywhere from 20 to 50% ridership return, lower on rail, higher on bus. So that's a pretty conservative estimate overall, keeping in mind that we hope a vaccine is going to come out over the next few months. We thought, given that we're a bus-only mode here, that 50% is a reasonable assumption for the whole of fiscal 22. So from July 2021 going through June 2022, presuming that eventually ridership is going to pick back up. So we felt comfortable with that. Some might even say that's overly conservative, but of course, I think we all want to be on the side of caution at this point. So that's where that's coming from. Does that address your question?
It'll work for now. Thank you.
Okay. And that really leads us into the fiscal 22 budget conversation, which pending any other questions, I'm happy to jump into that. It really is the same budget.
I have just a super quick question, and it may be covered later. Just on the electrification study, can you just share the timeline for that study and then who was actually awarded the contract? Just curious.
Absolutely. The contract was awarded to WSP USA.
Okay.
So they're going to get started hopefully within the next week or so.
Great.
I probably not get it right off the top of my head. I think we're looking at like 4 or 5 months for phase 1. So we anticipate really jumping into the data collection process with them and then holding a number of workshops for the next month or two for them to go through each area. And the first phase is very much focused on the facility, the movement plan, where chargers are going to go, and how we're going to, and that's really going to inform the design of the facility expansion. That solicitation is actually going out in the next few weeks as well, being led by the city's Department of General Services. So the work that we're doing with WSP is going to work right into and help partially inform whoever is going to be designing the actual facility expansion as well.
Great, thanks. Would you keep us just up to speed on how that's progressing from time to time?
Absolutely. And Raymond Moy, our AGM, is the project manager for that. So he'll probably be bringing those updates every month.
Great. Thanks.
Absolutely. Any other questions right now? All right. So for the budget for fiscal 22, again, which starts next July, it is the same budget that we presented last month, and this is the current services budget. What Martin will share later is we are assuming that we're going to provide the same number of service hours essentially next year that we're providing this year. Of course, it will be on different routes, the routes that have been determined as part of the Alexandria Transit Vision process that eventually, we hope to increase frequency over time on those routes. And there's a number of assumptions. We've talked about the ridership already. I'll just pause for a moment to talk a little bit more about this $400,000 subsidy cut. As you may remember, as part of the second version of the budget for fiscal 21, responding to the pandemic, the subsidy for Dash needed to be reduced by $400,000. At the time, we really assumed that was a temporary cut because of the situation that we're in, and that it would snap back once the pandemic's over. Additionally, we knew that we would be able to cover that gap because of the transit-focused CARES Act funding that has been made available to the city. And so we did not actually cut service in terms of a particular route, particular segment. That being said, overall across the whole system, because of the pandemic, we have been running reduced service, and notably the trolley is not running. So the combination of those two things, along with, as again, low fuel prices, has enabled us to deal with that subsidy cut in fiscal 21 without making an intentional service cut. As the pandemic continues into fiscal 22, we understand that the city may need to consider that a permanent cut, not a temporary cut. And if that is the case, essentially our current services would go down by $400,000. So that would be another area that we would have to cover with a service decrease at some point. Again, that's not going to impact us in fiscal 21 because we're already running reduced service anyways. But it may be something we need to consider in addition to the reduction option that we're going to talk about shortly. And we just want to make the board aware of that. As with all these cuts, once we know the final number from the city manager in the budget that he is going to propose, and then that council is going to consider and may modify, we're going to prepare the absolute best network that we can with the fewest reductions as possible, looking at a very detailed level, and we'll try to mitigate that as best as possible and cut other things if and where we can. But we just want all of this to be, on everyone's radar, as we look at this. So understanding that assumption is part of our current services. That's part of the 1.14 million that would be our budget increasing just to provide the same amount of service next year. We're also assuming that we would use any remaining CARES Act funds, so roughly 1.6 million. We're assuming no additional federal relief funds. Of course, that may change as we heard about earlier, but we can assume it. We are bringing $180,000 of revenue from exterior bus advertising to the table as well, should that be something that the board approves us to do. And on the expense side, what we're paying for is the increase in wage and benefit costs that's part of our collective bargaining agreement. Benefits always go up every year, and then very, very small non-personnel increases, only $150,000. And those are focused on technology and increased building maintenance costs. So I'll pause again there for any question. That's essentially our current services budget, and that's what is already before the city in their budget process. These are the numbers which are in your packet, of course. Not hearing any questions, Mr. Chairman, I would proceed into the reduction option, which we talked about last month.
Please do.
Again, we understand the greater environment. We've had a lot of conversations both with TNES and with the budget office. We understand that the city's facing a $41 million gap, and that reductions are likely to be exercised in this fiscal year. Just to reiterate what we shared last month, our target is $1.67 million. bringing 180,000 to the table in revenue, that leaves about 1.5 million that would potentially have to be covered with service cuts. One thing that's a little bit different than what we shared last month is we factored in the fact that, if we have less service on the streets, we're also going to be collecting less passenger revenue, assuming we are collecting passenger revenue, which we are. So at the rate we expect to be collecting revenue, that's $125,000 we would be losing from not providing that service. Therefore, we have to increase the expenditure amount of cuts to just over 1.6 million. And that is reflected in the potential cuts that Martin's going to talk about shortly. And of course, I think, all of you recognize, the city recognizes that DASH is an essential service, and, the DASH is going to be a big part of the economic recovery, of responding to human needs in the community, and also responding to climate change. And these are all focuses in the budget process, as well as the race and social equity lens that's going to be applied. So we know that DASH may not be the first thing on that would be prioritized to be cut, but we understand that it's very likely some cuts will be proposed because of the size of the budget gap. So that's the larger situation. What's next is Martin's going to talk about those potential cuts, again, that we may have to make depending on how the budget process plays out.
All right, thank you, Evan. Good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. As Evan has mentioned, we have a couple different scenarios here. He's covered the current services, the cost neutral scenario, which is the version of the ATV that would be cost neutral for next year. What I'll talk a little bit more about is the 10% reduction scenario, which was covered last month at the board meeting. But I wanted to share with you that we have some updates and refinements to those proposals based on some of the items that Evan has talked about, including the change in our revenue assumptions for next year, and then also the $400,000 additional service reduction that's necessary. So, and Josh, it looks like I do not have control, so I guess you can just plan to drive. Would you actually mind going back one slide?
Sure.
Yes, thanks. Right, so as I mentioned last month, we tried to take an approach to these reductions where we would focus, we would look at what current ridership trends are and just be cognizant of the situation that we're in. Obviously we're seeing a lot of reduction on peak service, peak routes, and less so on routes that operate all day. So we tried to kind of be a little bit disproportionate in terms of proposing reductions that would, be to routes that are having lower ridership right now. So perhaps the impact would be slightly less than it otherwise would be. So I've got a summary here of the different reductions that are proposed. I'll go through each of them very briefly just because we did cover them last month. I did want to highlight one major change. Josh, next slide, please. And that is that we are putting on the table the N12 route. This is the local bus service that runs through Seminary and Janney's Road. It's currently covered by the AT2 service. For the board members that were part of the ATV adoption last year, you'll recall this was one of the more controversial proposals that was included. We, in our draft final ATV network, proposed to remove this route, but based on significant, very significant public feedback, we decided to add it back into the final ATV network. However, since we're in a very different environment now than we were a year ago, and we're being asked to cut this 10% reduction, which is significantly less, the full ATV is an increase in cost significantly. The current service is cost neutral, and then now we're being asked to go 10% lower. It seems like based on the ridership, the current ridership on this route, and other factors that it's appropriate to include it here as well, to include it as a reduction here. So this is not something we take lightly. We have seen the fierce advocacy. We know how many people support this route. So we have that. And also we know that there's been a significant investment on the part of the city in this corridor over the past couple of years. So we want to be cognizant of that as well. But given the low ridership and what we're being asked to reduce by, we are including it here. I will note that we, as noted last year, There are some potential mitigation strategies that we could employ. One is that the AT2X we could have some intermediate stops added to the AT2X. The AT2X is a nonstop route that operates during weekday peaks between Mark Center and King Street. It's contracted by the Department of Defense. It does not currently stop, but it does run through this corridor. If we were to be able to arrange with DoD to allow this service to make intermediate stops, we could mitigate the impact. And that would be particularly effective because the majority of the boardings that occur on the AT2 on this route, the local boardings, are during peak periods when the AT2X would be operating. So that all being said, we did include that cut as part of this 10% reduction scenario. Next slide.
Martin, can I ask you a question before we go on?
Sure.
Going back to, so last year, remember that we did pursue conversations with DoD about, we were trying to figure out what to do about the AT2 and the ATV. And it's my impression, I wasn't involved in those conversations, my impression was that DoD was not particularly amenable to making changes. And if they were going to consider them at all, they wanted to renegotiate the cost of providing that service. So has there been any further outreach with them, or do we have any reason to believe that that position will be different this time around?
We continue to talk to them. We have regular meetings with them. We haven't spent time specifically talking about this issue. I think that there's been a little bit of a change in some of the staffing over there, so there's potential that there could be some additional openness to this. Their ridership is down significantly on that route, and we have the ability to renegotiate our contract for FY22. So it's possible that we could give them a little bit of a price break if they were to allow this, and we've actually assumed that there would be a little bit of a price break in our cost assumptions here. But I think it's still something that we need to go negotiate, and it's not a guarantee by any chance, any stretch. So just walking through these other ones, which are the same as they were last month, we would have a reduced service on the what's now the AT8 corridor. It's called the N3 as part of the ATV, but the Duke Street corridor into Old Town during peak periods. We had hoped to have all trips every 10 minutes to go into Old Town. With this reduction, we only have every other trip. So the buses, every other bus would turn back at King Street Metro, and additional transfers will be required. Next slide. And so the next item here is weekday midday service. This is the N5 and the N6. These are two routes that operate along the Eisenhower Valley corridor, the N1, the N5, and the N6. So three routes here. The N1 is currently the N7 in the Eisenhower Valley. The N6 operates a new route that operates in parts of Old Town. And then the N5 is currently the AT10, which operates in Del Rey and then up to Potomac Yard. We would be reducing weekday service, midday service from every 30 minutes to every 60 minutes, which is pretty substantial impact. This kind of runs counter to what the ATV represents in terms of improving off-peak service. So not something we take lightly, but it is necessary to get to the reduction target. Next slide. So this one is one that did change from last month. This is weekend service. We had previously included cuts to weekend service on the N5, which runs from Potomac Yard and into Del Rey and then down to King Street. We have added that back in. However, we're still keeping the removal of N6 Sunday service, and that's being included in this reduction. Next slide. The N11, which is similar to the current AT9, would have peak service reduced from every 20 minutes to every 30 minutes. That serves from Potomac Yard to Alexandria to Shirlington and all the way over to Mark Center, as shown there on the map. Next slide. And then the N23 and I guess it's not shown here, but N24 as well. These are the AT3 and the AT4 will be reduced from every 30 minutes to every 60 minutes during weekday peaks due to low ridership. One I should have mentioned, the weekend service. Could you back 2 slides, Josh? Yes, right there. I should mention that if we were asked to to make the full reduction for the $400,000 that Evan mentioned, we would also probably likely have to bring back the reductions to weekend service in this slide as well. So minor note that I wanted to make clear here. Next slide. So actually, let me just stop there. And if there are any other questions about those routes, I know that was a quick summary.
Martin, this is Larry Chambers here. So I got to tell you, I recognize that this is a series of tough decisions. There's no perfect solution to the budget crisis we're facing on this. That said, I don't see eliminating the N12 route on weekdays during FY22, when ideally we're going to be starting to ramp ridership back up. I don't see that as a tenable approach. I could see reduced service, but unless AT2X can really kind of fill that void, as somebody who's ridden that bus on a daily basis for years now, that's a full bus. Pre-COVID, we're standing room only during rush hour between once you got past Quaker down to King, it was a full bus. You're going to have a lot of really upset riders. You're going to have a lot of people who are going to have to find other means of transport that isn't nearby available. They walk through the neighborhood, I guess, down to the 8, which I've certainly done in the past. But I really hope that we can come to some sort of agreement with AT2X that'll address that need, because that's a major route. To eliminate it entirely, I just don't think, especially after the pushback we got last year, I'm actually surprised to see it back on the board. I don't see it as a tenable approach.
Okay. Thank you for the comment. I could maybe provide a little additional context that might explain why we've brought it back onto the table. And yes, there was a lot of public feedback last year. So certainly we want to acknowledge that. The reason that was originally included in the draft ATV, and the reason why it's being brought now, is that there are the majority of the ridership on the AT2, and the reason that the buses are full coming through this corridor is because you've got the passengers traveling from the West End into Old Town and vice versa. So you do have a lot of through riders through this corridor. With the new ATV network, we have designed it in such a fashion that we can provide 10-minute headways on 2 core routes, one that runs through the West End on Beauregard corridor, and then one that runs on King Street. We also have good service along the Duke Street corridor. So there would be a transfer required for those that need to commute from the West End to Old Town. However, because of the highly frequent service coming every 10 minutes, the transfer would be very, very easy. They would just get off the bus, and then within just a couple minutes, the next bus would come along. And overall, if you include the wait times that they currently have to wait through with the AT2 service, the travel time would actually be comparable, if not slightly better, depending on exactly where you're going to and from. So for people that are making that journey from the west side of town into Old Town or King Street Metro, there wouldn't be too much of a negative impact, and they actually be a net positive. The challenge, though, and where we're hearing a lot of feedback, is from those that live in Central Alexandria, Seminary Hill, the seminary there, Janney's Lane, those areas in there, Taylor Run. The ridership there that we've determined pre-COVID was about 100 boardings per day in that segment. As I mentioned, the vast majority of those are during peaks. I think we estimated about 75 to 80 of those boardings were during peak periods. And then I think it was about most of those, probably about 60 to 65 of those were at 3 or 4 key stops, the ones that presumably would be assisted by the intermediate stops in the AT2X. So, that being said, and all those numbers, of course, are pre-COVID. We don't have exact numbers for what it is right now, but the AT2 ridership as a whole is down by, I think it's almost 60%. So those numbers are much lower. And it is a sort of a peak heavy. As I mentioned, it's a peak heavy corridor. and our peak ridership is down even more so than the rest of our service. So it may be even lower than that. So those are some of the factors to consider. But as we've said, this is a very sensitive area. It's an area that really appreciates the transit service and advocates heavily for it, both with us and at City Council. So it's certainly something we need to be cognizant of.
Yeah, Martin, and thanks. I understand it's not, none of this is taken lightly, or none of this is done capriciously. I think it's just a matter of really thinking about, if we're going to approach this, we have to communicate it in a way that will make it politically viable. So I just don't see it working. I mean, even with the numbers defense, too many people feel really passionately about keeping that route moving the way it's been moving pre-COVID. I mean, unless there's something else I don't know here, I don't see it surviving as a notion. And so to that end, I'd recommend looking at maybe another way to go.
Hey, Martin, can I ask a question about kind of how you came up with the reduction in terms of looking at ridership based on COVID trends? So like, did you look at certain routes that ridership has continued to remain high during COVID because the folks in those corridors are potentially more transit dependent? And kind of the percentages of shifting ridership on certain routes versus other routes where people have other options to get around? And was that a factor in looking at ridership when you made some of the cuts here, in terms of, if we do have to make cuts, looking through kind of an equity lens, like where are we getting the most people access that need it?
Right. Yeah, that was definitely a factor in these decisions. The highest ridership, and I'll in the next item I'll be sharing some route level ridership information that'll kind of shed some additional light on these. But there are several routes that are still doing fairly well, comparatively speaking, and those include those in the West End, the AT1 Plus, the AT9, which runs along Northern Alexandria from Potomac Yard over to Charlottetown, and then on to Monk Center. And then a couple other routes along key corridors like the AT8 on Duke Street. So we've tried to really focus on maintaining service to those routes that are still doing really well. And you mentioned the equity piece. A lot of those routes also run through areas of lower income areas, on the West End, Arlandria, and parts of Duke Street. So really trying to stay away from making cuts to those areas. To the folks that are getting hardest hit by the pandemic for a number of reasons. So that was kind of a major factor. One slightly challenging part, but I think we've accounted for it, is that we're looking at current ridership patterns, and then we're trying to assign those to the future ATV network, which is a completely new set of routes. But I think for the reasons I mentioned, we have a pretty good understanding of where people are trying to go to and from. And so we're able to kind of factor that into these reductions that we proposed.
Martin, this is Jim. I've got a couple of questions. One is, where are you on? Will we have numbers that you can share at some point that run through what the ridership is on the N12? You said you didn't have those, but I'm assuming they're available. They're gettable. I think that might be a helpful data point just to have at our disposal relative to some of the other routes, given the history here as Larry outlined. And then the other question is, given the other bus that services most of that route, but not all of it, and you I think noted there are, I think three stops that sort of overlap. Again, to have some kind of sense of the math of like, based on that 100 trips a day versus what we might be today, like how many trips does staff estimate would be off the table, would no longer be available to the community if the N12 were to be eliminated? just so we're really getting maybe a bit more, I know we can't be totally precise because we don't know what the future of ridership will actually be. But I think it's a very different story if it turns out that, well, we're talking about 20 rides a day that will really be impacted versus 80 or 90.
Right. Yeah. So we do have the data from, we did a complete ridership survey by every stop, every trip as part of our ATV. So that's kind of what the data is based off of. We're not quite to the point where our automated passenger counters on board the vehicles are, we don't have enough of the fleet covered right now to have 100% coverage. We have about half coverage right now. We can dig through that data and give you some more specific ridership data from the last couple of months. We'll have some caveats in terms of sample size and things like that, but at least it will be something to work off of. I suspect based on the trends that we're seeing that it would be closer to the 20 number than the 80 number that you just mentioned. But we can certainly have that, for next time that we need to discuss this in February or March.
Okay. I mean, I think we need to be very sensitive and careful on this particular question and this route, but I think we also need to take the larger perspective here of, who is being served, and what number of people are being served by different routes and what those trade-offs are, and not only respond to the folks who are able to comment publicly, because we know there are a lot of people who don't publicly comment, that we're also trying to assist with the with the new ATV approach.
Good point.
Martin, it's David. So I know for the King Street trolley, we have no changes listed, but 15-minute service consistently throughout the year, 11 a.m. to 11 p.m. I wanted to ask, so the Old Town Circular, my understanding was when we did the ATV was envisioned to eventually have the trolley fold into that, because essentially you'd be having very high frequency service that would be connecting with King Street Metro to carry on, although the Old Town Circulator would be, the dash branding that we have versus, or, maybe some new branding that we developed specifically for those vehicles, but understanding, why we would, maintain the trolley then as is. We still have the Old Town Circulator, not quite as robustly as we had envisioned with the reduction to the N3, but talk a little bit more about, is that just because that's a contractual obligation that we have with the city, so we have to assume that that remains in place because that's what the city would demand, or was that done for a specific reason as we're looking at our own ridership and use of the system?
Sure. Thank you for the question. The trolley in our current services scenario and our 10% reduction scenario actually does have a minor reduction that gets it a little bit more, kind of trues it up to what the actual subsidy from the city is for the trolley. We would still have 15-minute service all day. We do actually add some extra service in the summertime just because we get some additional boardings then. So we add service in the summertime. We would not add service in the summertime under these scenarios, but you'd still have 15-minute service all day. So just a minor clarification on that. And then to get back to your point about the trolley and how it fits into the ATV and the Old Town Circulator. So yeah, when we developed the vision plan, the idea was that we could fold in the trolley into the Old Town Circulator to provide even more service and more frequency through that corridor. Ultimately, we kind of kept it a little bit separate. And the reason for that was that the city council sort of has jurisdiction over the trolley, so we have to kind of go down that road. The other concern was that when you're trying to coordinate two different routes in the same corridor, like we were trying to do with the trolley and some of the other routes, when one of those routes is free and the others are not free, it doesn't work quite as well because you end up having everyone waiting for the free service as opposed to just being able to jump on the next bus that comes along. So there were a lot of fair policy questions that came up and were covered in the ATV report. There was a lot of scenarios that were thrown out kind of hypothetically for future consideration by city council. You could go fare free in Old Town for all routes, which would make it a lot easier, but certainly there's a lot of cost implication to that and equity for the rest of the city. The other option is to begin charging for the trolley or to find other creative solutions to cover the cost of the trolley. So I think that was where we kind of decided that it was best suited to you know, go further down the road to have that discussion with City Council. So as it stands now, it's aligned. It's on the same corridor, the King Street corridor, obviously, as these other routes that we have going through there with the Old Town Circulator, but it's not as well coordinated as we would like in the long term.
All right. Yeah, appreciate that. I mean, I think that to points that my colleagues have made, you know, about some of the other cuts, and particularly Larry's, you know, concerns about the N12, which is one that I share as well, having, you know, the promise, knowing what we engaged with the community and the promises that were made about that service going into the ATV. But a lot of the cuts are very, you know, are very significant. Some of the reductions that are being made to, you know, we're having service in some corridors where there is a heavy demand for transit service and where there certainly are equity issues. So I mean, none of this is good, but I think that if we are, and we're several months away from knowing what our subsidy reduction would be, this is just what would happen if we did the 10%. And I'm glad that we flesh it out so specifically, because we need to be transparent with the community and with our riders about what are those implications, so people can decide, you know, what they want to advocate for and how they value, you know, the subsidy that comes to Dash, you know, relative to other services that the city is going to have to decide how to fund with a, you know, with a smaller pot of money. But, you know, I do think that, you know, if we're looking seriously at this, that this is how this shapes up, I think we have to engage more with council on what that service in Old Town will look like. Particularly, I mean, I would expect the trolley service is not going to come back at the beginning of FY22 because of the, well, I guess, you know, if we're going back to, but, you know, just because of the social distancing and the small size of most of our trolley vehicles, and you know, the fact that everybody has to come through one door and that you really can't distance at all on those buses. I mean, maybe with the barriers coming back, we'd say, you know, if the city wants to run that service, we're at a point where we can do it safely enough, although, you know, the trolley has been suspended for some time, and so I don't know what would exactly be the trigger to bring that back. But I think we need to look seriously at, you know, those issues of how we're serving different parts of the city and what we're providing people, because I know that's what our riders in the community is going to go out and look at as well. So, I mean, we have time to flesh that out, and I do hope that we're not at this position of having to make quite this number of cuts, but I think that's something that's going to be very important for us to look at more closely and to engage with the city and say, look, you've got to make some decisions about, you know, what this trolley is going to look like for next year, and talk to the business community and those that might be expecting that it's going to come back, and about, you know, what those alternatives are and what we can provide in place of it if we need to make some reductions there. But, you know, I think that, you know, I think there are savings there that we need to look at. So, but I appreciate, you know, I appreciate the exercise that we had to go through, and this is very difficult and, you know, heartburn inducing for all of us. But I think it also says, you know, to, you know, the neighborhoods that we live in and the riders that we know and the people who depend on the system, you've got time, which we didn't always have every year when we had faced significant cuts. We, you know, we're often making this list in the spring. You have time, if this is important to you, to talk to our local elected officials about why Dash is a critical service and needs to be funded. And to, you know, what Hillary said earlier about the Human Services plan of funding the ATV. Well, this is very contrary to the Human Services COVID recovery plan. And so, you know, we need to be, you know, advocates as well, and encouraging those who are advocates to work with the service. So, and to help us stay as whole as we can. So. And ultimately, the last thing I'll say, and I know I've been a little long-winded, is that, you know, we as a board will decide ultimately what we want to, you know, what this will look like. And so, you know, just as Martin has worked very hard within the guidance that we gave him and within the confines of the exercise to come up with this, but ultimately, you know, we don't have to accept a staff recommendation. We can make changes to this as we go, as long as we ultimately meet the targets that are set for us. So, you know, I want folks to understand that we, you know, those of us on the board, we are those ultimate decision makers. And so we will have an opportunity to shape this based on, you know, what we have heard is in the best interest of the community. You can go ahead, Martin, continue.
Okay.
So, excuse me, Martin, and just one clarification for the public. Whatever decision we do make, I just want clarification that if there's an alternative route, the public will be, that will be communicated to the public. So it wouldn't be as though their service is cut and they're left without options or, an alternative way of conducting their business. But I just want some affirmation that that is going to be the case.
Yes, we would do a significant amount of outreach, particularly if there's service that's being reduced or lost. There would be a lot of outreach that would be conducted. We would certainly provide information about alternate routes to the extent that they would be available. In this corridor, there's if we don't have the AT2X, there's not much to provide in the way of alternate routes, but you do, if you're, depending on where you're located, you may be able to reach some of the other routes that are running. But yes, there'd be a lot of outreach and we would communicate about alternatives.
Okay. Just to reduce the anxiety with respect to the cuts.
Right. Okay. Next slide, please, Josh. And this is a letter that we received that's part of your packet. I think this is just a portion of the letter. I believe the full letter is on page 26 of your packet. But I just wanted to highlight this to make sure that the board was aware. We did receive this letter from Park Place Condominiums. Park Place is a condominium building. It's about 15 stories tall, 400 units. It's located on Van Dorn. If you kind of think about Van Dorn, going north on Van Dorn, parallel to 395, you cross over Seminary, you cross over Braddock, and then it kind of bends before it hits King, before it gets close to King. And at that bend is where Park Place is located. Currently, they don't have any dash service. They do have a peak-only route from WMATA that's operating on reduced service right now. This letter is requesting that the board reconsider the addition of the N10 route, which was part of the ATV final plan. It was a new service that would be operated all day on that street on Van Dorn. So this is just a letter that we received in support of that improvement. Okay, next slide, please. So I'll just pause here and pass it back to Evan for a minute.
Thank you, Martin. Again, we understand and everyone recognizes the difficult situation that the city is in, likely cutting the budget rather than adding to it. At the same time, departments and agencies such as DASH have been allowed to submit supplemental requests as part of the budget process. And of course, we understand, as we've been discussing, that the ATV is a key part of the city's recovery plan from COVID, that it is aligning very well with the goals in terms of race and social equity, responding, encouraging economic development, responding to climate change. And so for all those reasons, we wanted to bring the supplemental before you here tonight, for your consideration to give us guidance as to whether or not to pass this along to the city for them to consider as part of the budget process. I won't say any more since we're all very familiar with what the ATV is, and I'll just pass it back to Martin to explain further.
Yeah, thanks, Evan. And again, we talked about this last month, so I won't go into too much detail again, but I want to emphasize that we all recognize the unprecedented budget situation that the city faces next year, and certainly we want to be cognizant of that and not, come across as that we're in a vacuum. But we do want to just keep top of mind the importance of the ATV and all the great benefits that it confers, including those to low-income residents, minority residents, seniors. This would be a game-changing bus network, I think, for the city of Alexandria and the overall mobility of its residents. So we are including this as a supplemental request and contingent on board feedback. Next slide, please. And this is just the map of the 2022 ATV network. Again, this is the first step. We have a 2030 ATV network that is the long-term vision. This will be the first step towards that. And for those that have not seen these maps before, www.dashbus.com/transitvision has all the maps. Next slide, please. And as we've noted, there's a significant cost associated with the full implementation of the 2022 ATV network, which is shown here, 3.4 million. And we provided a table that you can find in your packet. Forget which page it's on, but it covers basically the let's see, it's page 23. Yeah, 23. And it covers the what's included in that full ATV plan and the priorities for what we would want to include, what we feel would be most important in the event that we only got a portion of that 3.4 million. So we've identified a couple items that would be at the top of our list for that. I think that's the end of this portion, so I'll open it up to, this is just a calendar that just shows the schedule for the next 6 or 7 months, and the board actions and board important dates for the board and city council. So you'll see today, the board is being asked to approve or amend the proposed preliminary budget request, and then the next action will be in March when we have a proposed TDPM budget to present to the board.
Hey, Martin, this is Hillary. Can we jump back to the supplemental slide? Thanks. So just looking at this, I'm going to take over Jan's role with my city hat on, being the wet blanket here. Since he is gone, now you guys need that from me a little bit. I totally.
You don't have to, Hillary. You don't have to.
I'm going to. Obviously transit and implementing the ATV is important to all of us, but from the city perspective, I just want to make a comment. On the city side and on the transportation side, we're hardly been putting in supplementals for anything at all. And so just in kind of going through the packet, the pre-list of reductions and supplementals that departments have put in, 3.4 million is a lot. Cuts are very, very likely. And I guess one of the things that I was thinking about with this is, I was thinking about this in the way that we, when we're looking to apply for grant funding, we use a little bit of strategy too, and thinking about, well, we've got 7 projects, but if we put in all 7, like, are we going to get any of them, or do we really want to focus on something that we might get? My guess is 3.4 million is not happening, but it could certainly. Would the board want to consider looking at a scenario that for putting in a supplemental that gives some additional service, but maybe not quite the 3.4 million, because it's very unlikely that we would get 3.4. So is there something we want to put out there that becomes a little more feasible and we get something instead of nothing? So I just wanted to throw that out there and open for discussion, but being really clear, and Lisa can weigh in if she thinks that my statements are incorrect, but 3.4 million it's a huge supplemental in a really, really, really tough budget year for the city.
Yeah, so just some general context. I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with asking. It's certainly something that's been talked about, but a penny on the tax rate is $4.2 million. So you can put that into some general context. And I thought, yes, this is the slide, and I thought we have it in the board packet. I was going to say the best thing that Dash can do, and I think they have done for the board, is to list everything in priority order, because then that would allow the city manager to understand the board's priorities, and if some portion of funding can be added to this, he would likely want to work in the priority order. That's how he does it for all other city departments. He asks for their priority order as well as the focus areas. So that is definitely something that certainly would help the situation.
I guess I'll go ahead and start, and then certainly want to hear from my colleagues. I think Hillary and Lisa, I think this is an important discussion that is raised, and a point about what is likely this year. And it's so strange after just the conversation we had about what a 10% cut would look like, then to say, okay, well, let's just ask for 3.4 million. I think it is important that we ask for, because when we wrote this plan, we had a timetable and implementation, and spoken to council about, well, here's what we intend to do. And I feel that it is, council's responsibility to tell us, not for us to say, well, we know times are tough, so we're not even going to ask for this, but the council then to say, we want to delay implementation of this plan because they are more directly accountable to the community and have to then weigh all of those decisions. I do like the idea, though, of breaking each part of the ATV down and indicating what would be our highest priorities, because if we can get some additional money for those, it would be helpful. I was expecting they probably weren't going to fund this at all, but I felt like we had to ask. But I think that is a good idea of how we structure this supplemental, but that way we're not the ones who are sort of stopping the train on the ATV. Any others want to weigh in?
Yeah, this is Matt. Can you go back one slide, please? Actually, I think you went too far. It was the one that projected how much increase there would be to ridership. Yeah, okay, 100. My fear is we present these goals, and with the uncertainty of ridership right now, and whether it's ever going to come back to 100% pre-COVID, we're not going to attain those goals right away. I don't know what the rush is. I always think, like, I agree with Lisa and Hillary. We don't know what the future is. I mean, this is, again, the third year we're coming up on with just things are not conventional. I would hate to go into something and never see the ridership and never see our transit agency look like it did pre-COVID, and we're stuck, looking at ourselves like, wow, why do we look to expand when everything else was contracting? That's all.
I think it's been a very short while since we passed this plan, and we spent a lot of resources in developing it with the community. And I think we have to then consider what is what was promised to the community. If we sort of start to walk away from this plan so early on, I feel that we lose a lot of credibility with the community, and that's my concern if we weren't to address it at all. I think part of the idea of the ATV also was to recognize that there's also a shift away, even before COVID, of some of the work trips, so providing more consistent all-day services then as people are comfortable taking transit to do other things, or are working from home and are looking to run errands during a lunch break or after work, with a flexible schedule, to then be able to have that service available for them in a way that transit is something desirable. So the ATV could even support some of the long-term changes that are being made to how we travel. I think that was a something that we had recognized in developing that plan.
I get that, but I don't think anybody's going to hold it against us for what we weren't able to foresee. I'm not saying scrap it, but maybe a slow roll or a stepped implementation of it. We have to be flexible. I think that's the key.
So Matt, how would you structure a supplemental then? What would you knowing what the amount of money is, would you just pick a dollar amount? Would you pick segments of it?
I would do segments and prioritize what, using the ATV as a framework of what we want to, what we think is most crucial, and then go from there. Because I mean, the two things are, I mean, we made promises and we listened to the community, and that's great, and we're not blowing that off. But the reality on the ground has just completely changed. I mean, it's a paradigm shift, and it may go forever. So, I would just be very cautious about getting pigeonholed into, okay, by 2022, this is what it has to look like. By 2030, this is what it has to look like. There were things that we've put off before, like the A12. We gave those folks a year to come back to improve their ridership. Well, obviously that's been thrown into shambles with COVID. So we'll probably have to give them another reasonable period of time to up the numbers of their ridership. I mean, I think there's just so much has changed in the transit realm, as particularly here in Alexandria, I would just urge us to be as cautious and as flexible as possible.
Well, could we do that if we submitted all of the ATV but broke it down by segments and said these are our priorities and this is how much each would cost, but submit the entire list?
I mean, if that's fine. Yeah, I think that's good. Yeah, I would.
This is Jim. Can I ask that? Is that from a staff perspective, is that workable? For some reason, I've stuck in my head that it's kind of hard to implement the ATV in a piecemeal way, like by region of the city. Like you can do it by frequency of route, but like we're basically redoing all of the routes. And so isn't there a lot of dependency across the parts of the city? Unless I misunderstood what Matt and David were proposing.
Right. So this, I think what we would be talking about is not changes to the route structures, but change to the frequency levels. So perhaps you'd have certain routes that wouldn't be as high a frequency as you'd wanted them to be. So I think if you look at the table on page 23 and you kind of look at the far right column, you can see the priority order. You can kind of see that if we had, the first priority item is $660,000. So, that would be the first request would be for that amount. And then if you wanted to go higher, the next one's a pretty big request of 1.4 million. So, perhaps that helps guide it, but we would be able to increase on a route by route basis. But to your point about kind of by area, that gets a little more complicated and is not really feasible, I don't think.
And Martin, if you don't mind me adding, my understanding from the budget process, and Lisa, feel free to correct me, is, we would submit this and make clear it's a modular list, and that as the focus area teams look at it, as the city manager's office looks at it, they can choose, whatever amount, and we would just submit it understanding that not all of it could potentially be approved and that we would happily accept any portion of it. And, I don't know, Lisa, if it would be preferable for us to break it up into 9 chunks, or to submit it as one piece.
No, I think Evan, staff has prepared sufficient backup, like the table on page 23 of the board packet that could show the priority order. So you can submit like one large supplemental request, and I would just note it in your narrative that it is prioritized among X number of segments. And I guess another question I would have that might not be possible and hits on the same thing that Jim was just saying. We also prioritize on the city side, we prioritize together supplementals and reductions in one list, because sometimes there are situations obviously where while no one will happily take a reduction, they will take a reduction if they can move forward a different initiative. So that would be something that, if feasible, which it may not be, should be at least considered. Or you could possibly expect that type of question, some type of trade-off.
I think that might be a little challenging from our perspective, at least from my staff perspective. Just because I think the priority, if we were to include, the reduction in the 10% scenario, and then the ATV list on top of that, the cuts that we have made in the 10% scenario would be our top priority to bring back before some of these items from the ATV.
That's actually perfect then. Even just knowing that, I think for the city is helpful. Do you know what I mean? Like that statement alone is helpful.
And just to remind, to underline this point, ultimately, once we know the funding level, we're going to come back to you with a proposal. This is what the service looks like that we can put on the street at that funding level, whatever it is, with options for you to trade in and out, to achieve the network that you feel best serves the community based on the resources that we have available, and that's going to be coming to you in the spring.
I guess this is Jim again. I guess my concern about doing anything less than what's here on the supplemental, I guess, is twofold. One is this is for FY 2022, which starts July 1, right? The next year. And so I think obviously there is a hope that things begin looking very different by the next summer. That may not happen, but that's the hope. And then, you know, per the conversation earlier with MVTC, you know, there is also the possibility that, again, we don't know what's going to happen, but we certainly want to see, you know, the federal government come in and provide additional, right, funding. And that opportunity is going to come right once, the beginning of this next administration. And so if we believe it's the prudent thing to ask for, meaning that we think it's the right policy decision for the city to move towards this new route approach, then we should make sure that the request is at least in there as part of that ask that would then go to the feds. And we've provided, I think, very much in the spirit of the request from the manager, the zero cost increase version, which they can always fall back on for a year and delay this fuller request if reality on the ground politically doesn't allow them, right, to actually secure this funding for FY 2022. So I think my recommendation would be to kind of stay the course, and we've bookended the presentation back to council with what we want, what we think is the right approach if things go in a certain direction, and then a fallback, which is the zero growth proposal.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to echo what Jim said. That's similar to what the budget office is doing. We've been asked to prepare obviously one city manager proposed budget, but two alternate options as well, because there are a lot of unknowns right now, particularly the potential for an additional stimulus package that would allow for a support of revenue loss versus just expenditure like the first CARES Act that came out. So I understand where Jim's coming from. It's a very valid point.
So how would this be submitted if we were to go that approach?
I would, staff can submit it as they've prepared it for the board. So like I said, Evan and Josh, you can submit one item, but just note and provide the attachment of your priority ranking, that it can be considered in segments versus all or nothing.
Okay.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I might jump in here. Just I want to afford the board as much opportunity as is needed and desired to discuss. I just want to make sure to provide a little bit of guidance as to what the outcome needs to be, the eventual outcome of the discussion. And that is that from a board action perspective, there are 3 items here that need to be taken up by the board by way of a resolution to support or decline submittals as outlined. One being the draft budget, which for our new members, just as a reminder, this is not a final budget. It's just what is submitted to the city to work through. As Lisa pointed out, there's a whole process, and we come back to you multiple times, and of course in the spring come back to you with a revision of that based on what comes out of the city budget process. 2 is support of or a position, taking a position of the draft reductions. Again, understanding that those are not all in one. Those are compartmentalized in ways and can be taken or not taken ultimately by the board, dependent upon the total amount of funding that becomes available. So to Mr. Chambers' point of concerns and others who spoke about the AT2 and whatnot, having that in this does not preclude the board from resolving that at a later time in a different way. So just to be clear on that. And then of course 3 is the question of the supplemental and whether it is submitted as outlined by staff or if you desire to submit it in a different format. Or I might also recommend potentially just capturing from you the commentary and in your resolution around this, requesting that we include a communication specifically addressing this discussion in the context of how they're prioritized and to the point of the table and those kinds of things, and emphasizing why this is being submitted. Again, the position largely being to keep it on the table. I am as aware and as anyone that we are facing a very dire situation and have been tracking that very closely. I have great faith and trust in the team and in Evan and Martin. They have had their pulse on the their hand on the pulse here. So we do know though that there's also been some discussions in the past couple of days and as recently as last night by City Council about the direction. So this is still a very much a moving target. And this is a very early phase. But of course, as the policy board for DASH, you are the authority in deciding budget and service. So just to give you some context, please continue your conversation as long as you need to. Provide us any feedback. We're happy to incorporate that. But in the end, we will need you to consider taking up each one of these items either separately, or you may choose to do so all as one package, however you so decide to do that. And you may also choose, Mr. Chairman, to run that in any way you feel is best, be it a traditional vote, a roll call, or whatnot, if any members are concerned about positions. Okay.
Thank you, Josh. And there's some of colleagues we haven't heard from yet. Want to encourage you to weigh in on this and how we should go forward.
Yeah, I really appreciate the discussion that the board members have engaged in here. But I do think we need to follow through on not just the commitment that we made with advancing the ATV, but if the world as we know it changes with the development of a vaccine, and in the second half of calendar year 2021, the city and people who use our services are in need of them. I think it's important that we be prepared at least to advance what we've proposed so far, so that we can at least provide the opportunity for our services to be used by riders. And if the city can't support the proposals as we are advancing them, then we'll certainly hear from them. But if we go in with a too conservative approach, we might be at a point where we will not be serving our ridership, which is the core reason for our existence. I just share that with my fellow board members.
Thank you, Steve. Does anyone else want to be heard on this?
David, I hate to beat a dead horse, but what I think will happen is folks who can afford to work at home and use Zoom are going to be the ones using Zoom more often than going to work. So I think the rush hour paradigm needs to change. And generally, it's been my experience that a lot of lower income folks who can't work from home are going to be the ones shifting to use public transit more. And I don't know if the ATV necessarily captures the change that's going to be coming up with the change in economic and demographics using our network during rush hour.
So Matt, I think it's a totally valid point to raise or question to ask. And I guess my understanding, but I would like staff to weigh in here, is that actually the ATV was very much designed to optimize the routes to ensure that, frankly, the densest parts of the city where there are, frankly, essential workers, we didn't have that term of art, 10 months ago when we were talking about the ATV. But my understanding is that is actually exactly where the plus up will be as a result of the ATV. And then the purpose of the ATV was to move away from having kind of an over focus on peak, and to really have continuously reliable, frequent service across most of the city, which I would think would be even more important in a post-COVID environment for the exact workers that you're referring to who work different hours on different days, and not necessarily on a commute to DC type schedule. But I may be not totally accurate on that, but so I would maybe ask that question of staff. am I characterizing the ATV mostly correctly, or would you characterize it in a different way?
That was my understanding as well, Jim, so I'm glad you brought that up.
Well, also when we were doing the figures, though, we weren't anticipating this necessarily. So, I mean, I think it should be re-looked at or re-examined. I mean, it was the ridership versus coverage that we were talking about. And, you know, I don't know, I do recall seeing some stats on the economics, but I don't think it was that great when you considered that people would have to walk a quarter of a mile instead of instead of an eighth of a mile. So, I mean, I think all of the figures should be presented back to us so we can look at it anew.
I think the most impactful part of the ATV was that you were going to no longer have this huge ramp up around the traditional rush hours, is that people would have the expectation the amount of service would be consistent, not only on weekdays, but also on Saturdays and Sundays as well, there which wouldn't be as far as a drop off. And we had to make some trade-offs, for example, with what will become the N12 with the old AT2, you know, because we were originally going to drop that route and then trying to figure out how to add that back. We decided, well, that would only be a weekday only route. And there would be some routes that would continue to operate, like our Pentagon service, that would be weekday rush hour only, and would be, you know, probably continuing to serve the same population it does now, albeit maybe, you know, we won't need to have that as robustly because the ridership on those corridors would be less, but most of the service was you were just going to not have to have the timetable. You would just know this is how often the bus runs, which should be helpful to everybody, and the shift away from going to the office and to transit for other types of trips. I mean, we can certainly, you know, get and this may be helpful for some of our newer board members as well, who weren't here when we adopted the ATV, is to go through and make sure we all understand what those principles were that underline that plan. But I think, you know, to Jim and Steve's point, I think that was very much what we were planning to do with the ATV, was recognize that we knew in 20 years, even without COVID, there were going to be far fewer people commuting during those traditional stretches of time, and that didn't need to be what all our service was aimed at. Dash was even really designed around that, because it was actually called Driving Alexandrians Safely Home, was what it originally stood for. So, you know, when it was created in '84, it really was envisioned as mostly a rush hour service with some basic service to assist people traveling outside of those times. We've come a long way since then. So I guess Ian.
I'm surprised. I think the one thing that we can do differently, as recommended by Lisa, is to approach it in segments, which is a compromise that would probably, be acceptable.
And the chart that we have, I think, would allow the staff, you know, on the focus area teams to do that pretty easily, because they would see what the cost is for each aspect that's called for in the plan.
One question. So the 3.4 million, would that be a one-time cost, or we would need to program that into the budget each year?
That is an ongoing cost, and part of what we submit to the budget office is the projection 5 years out of that cost.
Gotcha. Thanks.
And then in 2030, we have additional increases as we go to a full implementation of said plan. And, you know, at that point, we probably going to be farther out enough that we will be making adjustments to that, because, you know, we try to anticipate how the city would look then. And, you know, it may at that point be less accurate, but, you know, we're only a year out from when we did this plan. So in terms of going forward, as Josh said, we have three actions that we need to take tonight. So they are the approval of the proposed budget framework for the year, given the assumptions that staff has brought to us to build the budget around. We have to then submit we have to go through the 10% reduction exercise as all city departments and services do. And then we have the decision about how to submit the supplemental. We can take these as separate motions, certainly, if we want to, and we can craft these in any way that we want to. I am going to infer from the discussion we've had so far that there, in terms of understanding the operating budget that we've built for next year, that there does seem to be consensus around that. We haven't heard a lot of questions about those assumptions and how we're managing some of those expenses that we have as we, begin to as we continue to ramp up our reopening. Is that a fair statement? Because if so, I'm going to ask if we can have a motion and dispense with that piece of this.
Jim, you're muted. There you go.
I make a motion that we support the staff's supplemental request and that it be combined with the zero growth, budget analysis, and that be shared, to move forward with council.
Okay, so you're moving you're moving 2 of the 3, Jim? Or are you moving all 3 of these?
I was intending to move everything, but maybe I missed the
I was
third.
just asking, I thought it sounded like there might need to be some further discussion about the supplemental. So I was suggesting that we try to at least take care of the core budget. But if folks are comfortable with the approach of submitting this as is your motion to submit these basically with the chart in priority order for the supplemental?
That was my recommendation. Of course,
okay.
Not everyone has to agree with that.
Okay. Well, you can put, you've put that motion on the table. I just wanted to clarify that your motion encompasses all 3 of the things we need to do here. And it sounds like you've confirmed that. So, is there a second to Jim's motion?
Second.
Okay, I'm sorry, I couldn't see who that is.
Well, that was Steve Kleist.
Oh, Steve, hi. I don't have the gallery view, so I just heard the voice. Okay, so we have a move and a second. Is there further discussion, or is there a desire to amend how we approach either the 10% or the supplemental request? So you can propose an amendment, you can propose an amendment, or you can propose a substitute motion at this point if anyone wants us to go in a different direction.
Can we ask for clarification?
From Jim?
Well, just on what it is on the third aspect of what we're telling the city we want vis-a-vis the network and what it's going to look like as we propose it.
Is that question?
Oh, to anyone. But yeah, probably to you, Jim.
I need to, I guess, go back to the previous slides. It's unclear to me. I was referencing back to David that there was the third piece that we wanted to make sure we were including, and I'm happy to see clarity from the chair on that if I wasn't clear enough in my motion.
Sure. So I'll try to help you out here, Jim. The first item here was the draft budget.
Core budget. That's the thing. It's core, then ATV, supplemental, and ATV.
Correct. Yeah. So this budget does not include the supplemental. This is just a budget to do what we're doing,
right?
With the cost neutral version of the ATV, and then it's followed by the reduction that we're required to submit to the city as a package. Which reaches that number you see on the screen right now, and then the third is the supplemental for the full ATV.
Okay,
understood.
so
Matt, does that clarify? I had been conflating 1 and 2 as one thing originally, which I think was the confusing piece.
yeah, that does, and I think that's why the chair initially called for 3 different votes on each of these, because. I mean, just personally, I'm totally in favor of the first 2. So it may, but whatever, I'm just one vote. So if you want I'm not gonna, it is what it is.
Let's separate number 3 then.
Okay, okay.
So Jim, would you amend your motion to include one in the core operating budget and the 10% reduction option?
Sure. I amend my motion to include items 1 and 2 and move those forward separately.
Okay. Motion has already been seconded. Is there further discussion on these?
Mr. Chairman, Larry Chambers here. You know, I would just say I don't know. Maybe I'm the lone voice here on the reduction option, but I am in agreement with the first point, disagreement with the second point. So if we go with 1 and 2 together, I'd have to be a nay.
Okay, let's separate all 3 then. I think as the chair, I think I'm not an expert on Robert's Rules of Order. I believe I can separate. I don't know if anybody knows who's more an expert on parliamentary procedure than I am. I think we can separate. I think I can ask that they be separated, or Larry, I think you make a request that we separate 1 and 2, and then we can vote separately on those. I think that would be.
Mr. Chairman, can I ask I guess point of information or clarification? Yes. So there have been a couple of requests for information as part of this discussion, both in the conversation with Larry about the N12 and also with Matt about the ATV. I thought we had frankly clarified Matt's question mostly, although it sounds like that may not be the case on the ATV and sort of like who's being served. So that seems like clarification that he may need. I don't know if others may need that. And then Larry's point at N12, you know, there had been some requests for additional information. I guess in my mind, I didn't believe that we needed that information to move forward on the big picture because it's about the budget numbers, not particularly on the N12. But if we do need that data to then be able to make an appropriate recommendation to council, then I think separating these things out would make more sense. It was not my intent, Larry, in particular, to move past that issue with my motion originally. I didn't think it was inconsistent with the discussion to request more information from staff.
And I think we have a deadline where we have to make certain actions because the city manager is going to require, correct me if I'm wrong, Steph, I believe that we have to have the 10% reduction option and supplementals in before our December meeting. So that is why there is a need to take action on this tonight. But there's nothing that's, as we've said, nothing here is set in stone. We're just saying so that there can be choices made about what does that reduction look like. And so we include that in there because, prudently as we look at the map, we say, well, if we got cut this far, this seems like where we would want to go. But understanding that there's a lot that can change and opportunities for public engagement. Public engagement is a genuine thing that is important so we can make up our minds on what we believe. But, it would seem appropriate with the information that we have now that staff has come forward with a prudent recommendation for what we would submit. And again, people need to understand that when you're looking at cutting this amount of money, if that's what it comes down to, there's really, there's just no way to avoid substantial cuts, whether it looks exactly like it is, but people need to understand it. This is not just we're gonna cut our subscription budget. We're gonna have fewer staff recognition events. This is there's no way to avoid massive reductions to what we do at the same time when we're recognized, what's in our supplemental, the ATV, as being the most essential transportation priority the city has to recovering from COVID for people who desperately need transit. But, there's a long way to go in this process. I guess that was the point I was trying to make earlier. And ultimately, we are the authorities who will make that decision. That's what I was trying to articulate my earlier comments. But so let me just ask that question. Must we act on these two prior to our next meeting based on the city's schedule? The supplemental and the reduction. Yeah.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, they're due Friday. So
they're due Friday. Okay.
Yes,
so this is our bite at the apple. Well, let's go ahead and get the core budget out of the way. So we're severing that from number 2. Let's go ahead and vote on that.
Mr. Chair, point of order is that you would have to get the offerer to accept the modification or to withdraw his motion as the motion stands on the table right now. If you want to break those apart, you would just need him to concur that and then to second that friendly amendment.
Thank you, Josh. You have a Robert's Rules of Order in front of you, or you've
No, I've had experience.
Been around this long,
experience. When you get multiple motions on the table, you just kind of treat them each as something that either has to be voted on or it has to be withdrawn or revised before a vote is made. That's all.
Okay, thank you. Jim, are you willing to revise your motion further to vote just on number 1 at this point?
I'm happy to do that, Chairman. Mr.
Okay.
Chairman.
Motion stands. Steve, are you still seconding the motion?
Yes.
Okay. So it's moved and seconded. Let's go ahead and vote on that. All in favor of the FY22 GM proposed operating budget? I'll signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Are there any opposed and any abstentions? Okay, that has passed unanimously. So do we have a further motion now on the, why don't we put a motion, if Jim, if you would like, put a motion on the table for the 10% major service reduction option, and then we can continue the discussion.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion that we vote in support of moving forward the 10% service reduction option, and that we note in that approval that we have also requested additional more detailed information on impacts, in particular on the N12 route.
Okay. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Second.
All right. We've got 3 seconds. Thank you. I don't know who it was.
I think
first.
it was even. I think
It passes. 3 seconds.
Okay. But so Larry, does that, is the way Jim has crafted the motion, are you comfortable with that, or do you want to request that we go a different way?
So, Mr. Chairman, I understand the need to move forward. I understand we're on deadline here, but I also believe that the way that the package is crafted, it will create a communications crisis that I don't want to wade into. But I don't think that would be healthy for this board or for the general plan. So if there's something that we can say, and forgive me, I'm bringing a nay here without having the solution to it. But I think that the rest of it I could move forward. I don't know enough about what those numbers are around those to object. But the N12 gives me great pause, considering the issues that this board has dealt with in the past, that Dash has dealt with in the past. And I think people will see in a time of a pandemic, when this board has previously tried to remove the route, using the strain of, it can be perceived as using the strain of the pandemic to push forward an agenda that Central Alexandria was in a furor over. So I can't, in good conscience, support it as is.
Okay. And I appreciate those comments, Larry. As someone who, many of us were on the board when we went through the ATV, and we heard about the importance of this service. And I will say, for anyone who's watching, for the record, I do not want to cut this or any of the other service reductions that are there. This is absolutely contrary to what we should be doing. And but ultimately it comes down to we have very limited ability to raise our own revenue. I mean, we certainly could put forward a fare increase to try to alleviate some of this next year. We have not proposed that yet as our response, because there are so many folks who are hurting, and we're going to have to first decide if we even want to restore fares at all, which if we don't is essentially could exacerbate this based on what the city chooses to do, because we'll run out of our care money, existing CARES Act money much faster. And if we get federal CARES money, this may, become immaterial, if we get another allocation. But I really appreciate that. And no, I understand the community has every right to be upset about these choices and has, but I would say has ample notice to advocate for things that are important to them, because these decisions will not be finalized until May, likely, or maybe even June, depending on our calendar. So, we're just being transparent about what's there. I think someone else is trying to weigh in on that.
I just want to interject and just also again me seek clarification. So my understanding, this is like a worst case situation, right? This is not what we are recommending. We are required, or Dash is required by the city manager to provide this view of a 10% reduction option, so that council has that option, which ultimately they will decide whether to execute or not. So this is like, if you have, you're looking for planning anything and you've got your best case scenario, your likely scenario, and your worst case scenario, right? This is your worst case scenario. We don't want this. Nobody, I don't think, on this board wants this, but we need to put something forward that is the worst case scenario. And frankly, putting the N12 on there in some regard makes it harder to accept this, which I would argue makes it more likely that council will support the core budget and or the supplemental. So I think there are different ways of looking at how we push this forward. And I think folks being upset about what's in the details of the worst case scenario is not necessarily a bad thing for what the goals of this board are, which are generally speaking not aligned with a 10% reduction in the Dash, in the ATV budget. So I mean, I don't know if that framing helps.
I think that's well said, Jim.
So earlier on, Matt asked for revised numbers. And we put as a condition, Larry, if we get these revised numbers and the situation remains the same, we can work with motion. If it's approved, then we could consider what you are proposing.
Ian, thanks for that. Yeah, and I understand the arguments for placing it here. What I don't see is a robust communications plan around it. The minute that this goes to City Hall, it doesn't matter if it's got the label of worst case scenario on it. It's going to be viewed as an official document of the city, an official plan, or at least a notional plan of the city. And that's going to raise people's hackles. Take it from a career crisis communicator. People are not going to read the finer points here. They're going to be pretty upset about seeing the route on the cutting block. And if we don't have a robust plan around how to communicate that to a group that we just landed this on a year ago and have been dealing with this now with for a year, hit COVID, and then we roll back into this. I don't see what I need to see in order to approve this going anywhere past this point.
So is a vote for this automatically, and if it's implemented, a vote against the N12? I mean, does it automatically go away?
No.
Okay.
No.
And would it go through the vetting process and public hearing and chance for us to all weigh in at a later date, correct?
So I'm going to start, and then I'm going to let staff, if they want to either correct me or jump in here. The city manager proposes his budget in February, which at that point we will know what our subsidy request is and whether any of our supplemental, which we hope for, is funded as well. And then at that point, we have to go, starting with the document that we submitted, and start to look at those cuts that we've already approved or anything out there. There's nothing to stop us from putting forward reductions or other cost-saving measures that aren't in there. I don't, if we got a cut this extreme, I think it would be very hard to expect anything that's going to come up that's not service related, because we already even exercised the, the one big revenue raiser we have, which is the ad revenue. That's already assumed in here as well, but it's only $180,000 net. So yes, no, we would have to advertise this, have public hearings in the spring, and it really doesn't become our official proposal until in March. We would come back. That would be our first meeting after the city manager's proposed budget. We would have to consider, what do we actually want to put out for a hearing. The hearing would be held, sometimes it's in April, sometimes it's in May. It depends on, we want to provide robust public engagement to our riders. And so we do that. And also the opportunity to advocate to city council, frankly, who has to make a decision by May as to what it looks like. And we, by June, have to approve what the final budget is. And at that point, it becomes what it is. It's really a hypothetical exercise, but it is in some ways a statement of, of what, you know, we consider to be most essential to maintain versus what we are willing, you know, to put on the table to have as a loss. So the city can then weigh, you know, what's important to maintain and what's important not to. And I also suspect that, you know, for those on the focus area teams are well aware of how much Central Alexandria values this service, and perhaps considered it to be, especially with the changes on Seminary Road, to have been, you know, important to, you know, if we're going to make a road safer to access transit and to walk and bike along, that, you know, to take the transit away is contrary to other policy, you know, statements the city has made. So I'm happy if any of our staff, or if Lisa or Hillary want to add, or Ian want to add to that, please feel free.
Mr. Chair, I want to give Linda an opportunity. She's been trying to get off mute.
Oh, yes, please.
That's
okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's okay. This is really helpful. I'm new to some of this discussion about the Seminary Road thing, so I'm just very interested to just hear a little bit more about it. Larry, from your perspective, is this the only cut that you feel like would be kind of raising a red flag for that would potentially create havoc, or is it kind of every one and that's just an example?
So, thank you. Yeah, it's the only one. You know, I'd have to go back to our previous meeting notes to look at what. Forgive me, I put it to the group here. You know, how long? I'm not sure how long we've had this 10% reduction as part of our discussions. At least our last meeting. And now this drops the final meeting. You know, when we've got 2 days before the deadline to go to the city manager. It's just a bad look. And this is one that was highly controversial last year. I live in Central Alexandria. I use the AT2 bus myself, but to take personal bias out of it, I'm also able to walk to King Street or to Duke Street to catch a bus if I need to, or use other routes. That said, just from the view of just how it was communicated last time, we're going to have a crisis on our hands again, and it's going to be mud on our face if we try to push this through, even just into the very beginning of discussion at City Hall.
So I guess if that may be the case, I guess so I think, Jim, your point is good, that makes them like, it's kind of a poison pill to take the whole cut, basically, in a way. But it may kind of cause a lot of problems for us too, I guess, is the concern, right? So the question is, the poison cut more in the other direction, which is just creating trouble for the whole operation. I guess the one question I'll ask, and I'm sure this is a tough one, because I'm sure there's a really good reason why all the things are on the list of cuts, but is there another candidate we could put forward, or is it like not that easy? I guess I direct that to Martin or whoever on the operations side for service trimmings.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, it's a really good question. I was going to chime in. I think with a cut of this magnitude, it's really difficult, and we're kind of, from this list, we've kind of exhausted most of the, you know, feasible, reasonable cuts that we feel like we can do with the new network. So, you know, when we do get that final number from the city manager in February, we have the opportunity to revise some of these. But if we're still at 10%, you know, it's going to be a really difficult choice one way or the other. If you were not to want to, if we did not put forward the N12, you'd probably be looking at cuts to other routes in other parts of the city, potentially removing those routes entirely. And those routes and those segments would have higher ridership, significantly higher ridership than what we're looking at here. You'd probably look at further reductions to weekend service, to the point where we have to remove weekend service on some routes, where we're really trying to grow ridership and develop that, you know, all day, 7-day network. So, and many of those areas would be in you know, less affluent areas that would, you know, have concerns about equity impact on them. So it becomes really challenging with a cut of this magnitude to come up with something that would be less impactful from a ridership and equity standpoint than what we have here.
Larry here, Martin, thanks for that. You know, and that's the sort of language that I need to see around something like this before we push it forward. You know, when I talk about having if we're going to push this thing on, we're going to need to be able to talk about it in those kinds of terms that are really like get at get at people's feelings around this stuff. The numbers are good to have, but be able to really state, look, this is a hard decision. There's not a better option for us here as a city, unless you really want to take it out on the people who are going to suffer most. So that's the sort of thing that I don't know, Martin and Josh, if your communication staff has a robust plan to talk about this. But the minute that this leaves the board this evening, there are going to be an awful lot of upset people in Central Alexandria. And we're going to be able to talk to them in those kinds of terms in that way. And so I push again, before we move this forward, we need to plan on how we're going to talk about it if it's going to go.
Let me make a suggestion going off what was just said, Larry. Could we add something to the chart that basically explains, so on this document, what the impact is of each of these cuts? I think we have, actually I don't, we categorize whether it's a moderate or a high impact, but we don't really have any loss of ridership figures, which usually I know in the spring we would have that when we went forward to a public hearing, but also just talking about some of those, for some of these routes that we're not cutting a little bit, we're having some of their service, these are areas that are very low income that have high transit dependency. It'd be helpful to note that when this goes up, and then with the, N12 to talk specifically about why, that was kept for the benefit of the neighborhood that lives along Janney's and Seminary, and what those impacts would be. So at least people are seeing that we are not suggesting that this service is in no way needed. I also think people on the N12 would quibble with, our moderate, given that we're discontinuing a route, probably would consider that to be a high impact rather than a moderate adverse impact. But if we, and I know time is short, but if we could add in some of that context, I think that would get at some of Larry's point, at least help people understand, that we know, what the impact is, and that we, are going to have to weigh those factors as we go forward, and probably would be helpful for the focus area teams as well to have that, particularly those who don't normally work on transportation issues in the city.
Mr. Chair, if I might just sort of help you all along a little bit on this, a couple of thoughts. One, first and foremost, I think all of this feedback is really, really helpful, and I hear it. The first thing I wanted to vet out is with my staff, and it's we just kind of got to do this right here, and that is the question of how much of this detail is absolutely critical to be submitted with the city budget, as compared to a more generalized 1.4 million cut. In theory, the reason that the city is asking for us to go into this detail is for exactly what Jim's point was, which is to illustrate magnitude of impact. If we're too general about it, or provide too many different varying possibilities, you start to have trouble tracking down what the magnitude of the impact might be. But I would ask my staff first the question of what level of detail is necessary, because if it were possible to submit a more generic version that doesn't lock us in as well, and this isn't locking us in, let me take back that comment. You're not locking yourself in this proposal. However, I'm recognizing Larry's concern as it relates to that, how that would look, right? So if there's a way to address that, do Evan or Martin see anything there, or even Lisa, who's deep in the budget process, that would make that possible? Let me ask that first question, then I want to come back.
I might defer a little bit to Lisa's feedback here. I mean, of course, OMB, the budget office of the city, wants as much detail from us as possible to inform their process with the focus area teams in the city manager's office. I mean, we could, for instance, just have a narrative of these are the types of routes and the types of changes, that the board may have to adopt with a cut level of this size, and not submit, for instance, the table that we've prepared. But that may or may not be the level of detail that they're looking for. And, while we're going to submit this all on Friday, it's not as if we're going to stop talking at that point. We're going to have an ongoing back and forth, with them as they seek clarity from us, you know, and we're going to sit down with the city manager, you know, with his office. So, yeah, I think that could be an option. And Lisa, you know, I don't know to what extent that might be acceptable to OMB.
I mean, ultimately, I think it comes down to transparency, right? So there will be continuing discussions from, I mean, the discussions have already started. Staff have been working closely with OMB all year on this, especially as it relates to COVID and other matters. So the discussions will continue regardless. If something is submitted that's generic, it's just going to ultimately lead to more conversation and discussion, right? And I think we're always going to, just like Josh said, we're going to try to get to the place of impact because there are multiple strategies involved. Even the strategy that Jim and Linda presented earlier, that is a strategy that we also use with the city manager as well, knowing things that can't cut, but we really need to provide context and discuss impact statements. And it is hard to do that when it is generic, right? That doesn't mean it's not doable. What that usually means is the budget analyst and somebody else from the budget office, and in this case, TNES will probably sit down with Josh and staff and get some more detail, of which I'm sure that, you know, everybody would update the board on as well. But I will echo what you said, Evan. The conversations don't stop. The conversations continue all the way through February, through the proposed budget. And even then February is only when we begin our public deliberation process with city council and the public at large. So, you know, for us, the final decisions really aren't made until April 27th, May 5th with final add, delete, and budget adoption. I don't know if that helps, Evan. I mean, if it goes generic, we will just ask more questions, basically, to get to the impact statements. Whether that's at the focus area level or not, I don't know, but certainly for the meeting with the city manager.
Well, and I think that, sorry, go ahead, Evan, if you needed to add anything.
I was only going to say, you know, we would anyways, and we could make very clear in this proposal that, of course, the board is going to make the final decision as to what service cuts may be made, if any are required, you know, and that these are illustrations of the magnitude of impact. You know, and there are others, you know, that we could put on the list. You know, as Martin said, many of them have a higher ridership impact than those that we've identified on this list so far. But just, you know, to make very clear in this process, which is basically an internal process until the manager proposes his budget in February, you know, that these are not final by any means.
So let me, to that point, maybe the answer here is to provide not just this one recommendation of it's going to be the N12, but say, here are the possible impacts of this 10% cut. And you give a couple of examples of the N12 cut is eliminated, you know, or one of these other routes. And that's, and we state that the board will ultimately make, right, a decision, you know, based on, right, public input or whatever, however you want to phrase it. I don't think it's appropriate to obfuscate the possibility that this would lead to the N12 route being eliminated, because it's clearly a possibility. I don't think we should hide behind it. But I hear Larry's point about, I'm also not convinced that we should commit to that as the only pathway at this stage, even though it may be the, you know, as the staff has outlined, given our priorities, it may be the path that we would ultimately recommend.
Yeah, and I would also say I don't have a crystal ball for all of this, but you know, the budget office submitted requested 10% reduction options from everyone this year, including partners that typically were excluded because of our projected budget gap. It's early in the process. While I can't sit here and say we won't take a 10% reduction, we won't take a 7% reduction. I mean, I think everyone on the city side is working very diligently to find the least painful of cuts. But I will also say that, as Hillary mentioned earlier, the pre-list items that went out are full of painful cuts. That's what happens when we're at the 10% reduction option. So I agree with what Jim's saying too. We should be transparent, but should be clear that it's a possible option, and obviously if it's one that could be avoided, will be. I'll also say right now the city's budget office, their website is open for public comments to be submitted online. So there's an opportunity for people to share their comments around these particular issues and larger transit issues before the budget process is submitted. Those will be shared with the city manager's office.
Can I try to move us back to a motion given time? And I think we've had a robust discussion. Evan, question for you or other staff, whoever can address this. So we're focusing on the N12. It sounds like there are other possible routes that could be cut or cut back. Can someone just state one or two of those, what they would be?
I think Martin's the best. Yeah.
Martin.
Yeah, I can jump in on that one. I mean, as I mentioned when I was going through the maps, one of the previous ones that we had included was weekend service on the N5 and the N6. And yeah, Josh, thank you. And actually, it might be best if you go back two more slides. Actually, that one right there, perfect. So you can kind of see the N5 area there. It's currently the AT10. We would potentially just be removing all weekend service from that as part of the offset for keeping the N12. And then the other one is the N6, which you can see goes through Old Town North South. And that would be also no weekend service. So you'd have areas like up in Old Town North, parts of Del Rey, really Old Town North is the main area of concern that would have no service on weekends. And then there's some parts of Alexandria as well that are served by the AT10/N5 that would also lose all weekend service. So that.
Or I just want to clarify. These are routes that would be impacted in the existing recommendation that we're making, or that could be impacted along, or could be the N12 at some mixture of impacts. I'm just trying to understand, because what I would like to do, just so you understand my intent, is make a motion to support a recommendation to move this particular item to council, but to clarify that there are multiple routes that could be significantly reduced or in some cases eliminated, and to list those routes in our recommendation that would include but not be exclusive to the N12. That would be my recommendation.
Okay. Yeah.
But I would need a list to be able to put it into the motion. It feels as if we're singling out the N12 in the way we've talked about it up to this point. We may have lost the finer details here, which are that actually there are a bunch of different routes that are being impacted, of which the N12 is simply one.
Right. So what I'm talking about now, the weekend service on the N5, the N6 going away, that is not currently included in the 10% reduction. It was previously, but we removed it in this last iteration. The reason that we did remove it is because we estimated that there'd be close to
ridership, more people impacted.
Right, exactly. Several hundred people would be impacted on both of these routes, and we wanted to take a less impactful, to take an option that was less impactful to ridership. But sorry, go ahead, Evan.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to clarify real quick, make sure everybody understands. The N12 cut is one of 8 cuts that we need all 8 of them to reach the 10% target, right? So, and we could propose, option number 9, number 10, and whatever combination, is what we would end up doing to meet whatever reduction target we may have to in the spring. But, it is not solely an N12 cut that's being proposed as a reduction option.
Is it fair to say that the list of the 8 cuts were all basically the lowest ridership impact cuts, that you basically took the 8 low, that to add up to that number, and these were basically, you needed to take the first 8 on the list, and that anything else that we did is going to have a more substantial ridership impact than what is on this list? Is that fair?
That's a fair assessment.
What if we just said that on the chart, just said, here's how we would meet that goal, and basically using the lowest ridership, so people can see, well, why is the N12 on that list? Because it has a lower impact than other cuts. However, the board is, if if we go ahead with it, we can add a statement that if we have to go ahead with a cut of this magnitude, the board would reassess and would consider other factors, including, you know, community and rider input to make these ultimate decisions. But that explains how we came up with this list. And that, you know, again, underscores the need for advocacy to council and the manager. How do folks feel about that?
Here's one more question, maybe for Martin. So I mean, say we don't get a 10% cut, say we get an 8% cut or something else. I mean, is the N12 first off that list?
Well, I think that's based on the feedback we received tonight, and
it's our decision ultimately. Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, staff may recommend that, but we don't have to agree to it.
Yeah, and I think that's the sort of thing. And if we're going to go this route, I mean, we'd have to say that this is not a priority among the ones that are listed here. This is not a priority cut. This will be only if we get to that 10% number. I have to go to the most stringent, most difficult decision or remove the N12. Otherwise, again, I think this is going to play really badly coming in under the wire. So like, it's a week before we set this thing up. There's no way this looks good for us. There's no way it looks good for us.
So in order to maybe try and figure out a way to move this forward, would it be possible, so we have this adverse impacts section of the chart. What if all of these routes are just on the table equally? And then once we figure out what our actual target is, and staff has more time to pull together ridership and impacts and more data for us to look at to see, okay, how many people actually are impacted by these routes at that point, because maybe this could all be a moot point because maybe we don't have, you know, maybe it's 5% and we all agree on that 5%. But to move this forward, if all of these routes are just equally on the table for discussion, if we actually do get to the point of the 10% cut, I mean, how would people feel about that? So we're kind of taking out this priority of these cuts, and that's a future discussion once we know what our actual target is, our final target.
I think that provides us with flexibility. And a question for Martin is, do we actually have to eliminate routes or can we reduce service?
So the 8 cuts that we've listed here are a combination. They're mostly service reductions. There are a couple route eliminations, including the N12, but it is a mix. We have the option to reduce service. That is possible, yes.
So
I'm fine with that.
Earlier in the conversation, it was raised to go general, and I heard there's a concern around transparency if we sort of go with the generic approach here. But I think that the minute that we put this down in print and it goes through an official process of being voted on, it becomes an official, whether we like it or not, it's an endorsement. Whether we call it an endorsement or not, it will be viewed as an endorsement. I strongly recommend that we just take all of these off the list and say, you know, we're working towards getting to this. We've accepted the budget number, but I don't think we should be laying out, if we're going to be including this, third rail, I don't think we should be laying out these routes for cuts in any sort of official documentation, because the minute that it goes through, it's going to be viewed as an endorsement from this board. And that's something that I'm not prepared to do. I think at this juncture, I think this is the sort of thing we would need to prepare the community for the minute that we knew there was a 10% reduction coming and that this was going to be on the table months ago. It's not going to be good. I can't tell you. We've got to take these off if they're going to go through.
So I would like, in the spirit of moving things forward, I hear Larry's position. I haven't heard anyone else echo Larry's position on this call as strongly as Hugh have stated it. I'm certainly very sensitive to the political issue there in Central Alexandria, and I think we should address it in response to your feedback. But I think we need a solution. I think that everyone can get behind on the call. I would suggest that we align with what Hillary was proposing, which was to list everything and say there are 8 of these 10. If that's accurate, staff can confirm. So will have to be put into place, and we will make that decision, based off both public feedback and updated ridership numbers. I don't know how we want to phrase it from a date perspective, but early 2021, and that also gives us time to get the data from staff, because I think Martin was clear. I asked, right, Larry, whether or not we had the data, updated data for N12. We do not, because we haven't received it yet. And so, I think staff's making a conclusion right now based off of the data that they've had in the past. That data may be different in 3 months or 4 months. It may not, it may be the same. So, but I think we need to be transparent as well and not hide the ball. And from a communications perspective, I think getting out in front of it is actually, by sharing the information now, is actually better than hiding it and then bringing it up at the last minute in February, March timeframe, personally. So my motion is to move forward with a recommendation of the 10% scenario, and that we include all 10 potential cut scenarios, and clarify to council that we will be receiving, if the council decides to endorse a 10% cut, that the board will make a decision on what those cuts should actually be, based off a combination of public feedback and an examination of ridership, of riders that will be most impacted by those cuts.
Jim, for clarification, the 9th and 10th cut, is that the AT5 and the N4 and N5 weekend? Oh, excuse me, N5 and N6 weekend service, or what are the 2 cuts that are not currently on the list?
Yeah, I'm confused, and I'm trying to look at the screen, not the packet, because there's so many screens up. But that's my understanding, is that Martin had showed those as the things that we looked at, staff had looked at, and then had not ultimately put forward, and put the N12 instead, because more people would be impacted. Again, I want to be clear here too, just from a policy perspective, like, more staff believes more people will be impacted by cutting these other routes. So I understand the politics of the N12, but there's also math, and we should take math into consideration later. I recognize we don't need to do it today, but math matters as much as public sentiment matters, if not maybe more. So I will park that for right now, and we can debate that down the road when we've got the actual real numbers. But yes, my understanding from staff is that these were the other options that they had considered that were then not included in the recommendation that they had put forward to us to endorse. But maybe Martin, am I right or am I wrong? Please clarify.
That's correct.
So Jim, 2 points here. In terms of transparency, problem I see in terms of transparency is that this is landing with the board for review 2 days before it's supposed to go. And this is the first time we're seeing N12 on the list. And as for math, I haven't seen any numbers that convince me of anything in this entire discussion. We don't have them. They're based on old numbers or inaccurate numbers. It's all notional. This is something that has been viewed as a community as something that has been an agenda item for the city to remove. And it's going to be seen as squeaking it under the wire kind of a move to add it to the list tonight. It's a terrible idea. I stand by that. Math included and transparency included.
All right.
So I think the language that David offered, I think the language that David offered moves closer to what Larry is saying, because it gives us how we derived at the decision without naming a particular route.
So, Mr. Chairman.
I think we should include that and just say that was the rationale. I mean, I'm not sure how it's untransparent to say that this is a possibility that can be cut so that the community is on notice of this. And, our process is different than, so my understanding is that for most of, I sit on the Commission on Aging, which is not, we are a advisory group. And so Human Services is going through this exercise as well, Aging and Adult Services component, and is putting up 10% cuts. Those cuts are being developed by the staff. The Commission doesn't see that until after those cuts are submitted. And the Commission may then end up in the position of basically opposing things that staff, sent up and advocated for. Our role is very different because we are this nonprofit corporation that is sort of very separate in how it does things. But, I would have to think with a 10% cut, we have Parks and Rec probably saying that they're going to close recreation centers. We probably have, the library board probably suggesting that they're going to severely curtail library hours. I mean, there's going to be pain throughout the city, but people need to know in the fall, and even though it's going to cause anxiety about what those potential impacts are, and whether the response to that is the city needs to then go out and raise more revenue, or there's a different set of cuts. But it comes down to a discussion of what our values is. I actually think it's completely transparent that we provide a lot of detail in this list so people can understand how are we looking at this right now. And people in the city are actually, because of the way we do our business, are actually getting more insight into what our thinking is than we are from other departments where this is completely a staff-driven discussion, because it's all hypothetical at this point until the city manager decides what reductions he wants to take.
I think you're making a strong argument.
Restate my motion and take it to a vote. You had amended my motion. I think there was a
calling the question, Jim?
I'm sorry. I had made a motion. You then sought clarification. And I would like to see if there's a second to my motion, and then move it to a vote if there is a second to my motion.
I thought we did have a second I thought it had been seconded.
Oh, Mr. Chair,
but if not,
yeah, his revision has not been seconded yet, but it is on the table. So point of order would be to allow for a second, and then you can consider further debate or call a vote. And Mr. Chambers can
Jim, would you please restate the motion?
My motion is to support the recommendation presented by staff for the 10% cut scenario as required by the city manager of the board, but to present all 10 potential cuts transparently in that recommendation without choosing which of those cuts we would be recommending putting forward, and stating that the board will consider both a combination of ridership impact and public feedback in making a decision on which of these 10 cuts to make, if the city council were to embrace and support, if the city council were to support the 10% cut scenario.
Okay, so we have a motion. Is there a second? I'm sorry, I couldn't, because I can't see the screen. Not sure who that was.
This is Hillary, second.
Oh, hi, Hillary. Thank you. Okay, so we have a motion, a second. We are getting very late in the evening, but I would say if there are any final comments, we should entertain them. Otherwise, I do want to call the question, but I want to allow if there's anyone else who wants to be heard on this.
One discussion point, who drafts the actual letter reflecting what we are agreeing to that goes to city council? Is that Martin or Evan?
It's an internal form that is submitted to the Office of Management and Budget, and we would include all of the detail per the motion that's on the table.
I mean, because part of the motion is it's a little bit on the vague side, but how much further would you expand it and editorialize? That's why it would been nice to see it before we actually submit it, but I realize that's not possible now.
The detail of it is essentially what's in the board packet. Okay. There's other numbers that are prescribed by the form, that are at a much more detailed level, account by account, things like that. But the narrative is essentially what's before you in the board packet tonight.
But you'll add in there Jim's, I guess, second or third clause that says, nothing's really set in stone until the public has the opportunity to debate it with us and to deliberate with us. Something along those lines. Okay.
Absolutely. It already outlines that process, but we would add particular focus on those issues as has been discussed this evening.
Okay.
And the city manager has included that language in the, but any year we've had to make a reduction, that language is included in the page about our reductions in those proposal, that it is our, we are the authority on that, and that, you know, we have not,
Yes,
this is how we
and
may do
any
it, but we're
impact.
not.
Yep, any impacts are potential options. We make sure it's very clear that the board makes the final decision.
Yeah. All right, I'm going to go ahead and call the question then. All in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions?
Opposed.
Opposed?
Larry,
Okay, Larry.
Larry is on record as opposed. Jeff, you raised your hand.
Opposed.
So you have an opposition from Larry and
Opposed, Jeff? Okay.
left and Jeff Bennett. So
Okay.
you do have a majority though, according to my calculation.
Okay. We have the full board still on the call. Do we need to note if anybody has left at this point for these votes?
As far as I could tell from what lit up on my screen, it's a little hard, but certainly if you would like clarification, you can certainly call a roll call vote. It's up to you.
Well, let's do a roll call vote just to make sure we're very clear as to.
Mr. Chairman, can I recognize as my motion. I think everyone's voted, but can I ask a question? I'm just curious.
You want to ask a question, Jim?
I would of a fellow. This is weird because we're not around the table, so it's a little hard to know how to gauge here. I'm just curious because obviously we're all trying to get to consensus when we can. Jeff, I don't believe you had engaged in this conversation that we've been having on this topic, so I would love to hear your point of view and why you are opposing the motion, because I think it's important for us to have the dialogue. I mean, I think Larry has expressed his views, and we've had a good back and forth. But I'd love to hear if you have a different perspective on this that we should be aware of before finishing the roll call here.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know these are tough decisions that we have to make. We're going through similar situations in DC where I work. I just feel very strongly with the recommendations that, we should take more time. I know we don't have that time since the recommendations are due Friday, but quite frankly, I just feel like a decision is being kind of shoved down my throat, and I don't feel comfortable with that. And so, and I know these are preliminary recommendations to the city manager, but, that's my position.
Let's go ahead and call the roll.
Chairman Kaplan, how do you vote?
Yay.
Vice Chairman Kleist?
Steve Kleist votes yes.
Miss Bailey?
I vote yes.
Mr. Bennett?
Nay.
Mr. Chambers?
Nay.
Mr. Greaves?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Miss Henty?
Yes.
Mr. Kapsis?
Yes.
Miss Orr?
Yes.
Miss Thomas?
Yes.
Okay, we have 2 noes and 2, 9 yeses.
Thank you, Beth.
You're welcome.
All right. So we have one motion left, which deals with the supplemental request for the ATV. And, after the discussion we just had, wouldn't it be incredible if we actually are talking about adding service this year? And although much needed, as we know, the community, transit is a very important part of our economic recovery. Do we have, and we've had some discussion about what the ATV request would look like. I'm going to suggest that we do perhaps do a bit of a refresh on the ATV, either at our December or January meeting, just so we're all clear kind of on what the goals and underlying principles are and what the 2022 and 2030 plans would look like. Doesn't need to be a deep dive, but I think that would be helpful for all of us. But can we have a motion to go ahead and proceed with the supplemental request?
I move that we move forward with the supplemental request.
Okay, moved by Ian. Is there a
Second.
Okay, I think it was Jeff first. Is there any further discussion on this?
So, yeah, so we're asking them to implement the ATV that we approved last year, right?
Yes.
And if we have a 10% reduction, and including the elimination of some routes, wouldn't we need to recalibrate the ATV going forward?
I can try and respond.
Well, I think, well, I mean, oh, go ahead, Evan. Or Martin, yeah, please.
Just to understand, to make sure I understand the question, is it that if we had to do a 10% reduction and then get back to what we wanted to do with the ATV, we'd have to recalibrate, or you're saying?
No. So if certain routes were eliminated, the ones that we were putting up in our last motion, in the worst case scenario, then what we're voting on now would not look like what is available to us going forward, right?
Right. I think they're mutually exclusive.
Okay. Are you okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Explain that though. Like, let's say one route gets eliminated or two routes get eliminated. What would the new map look like? The same map without those two routes?
Well, if we're talking about routes being eliminated, we would basically be taking the current services version of the ATV that we've submitted or that we've provided, and just taking those routes or reducing those routes by whatever if it's 5% or 6% or whatever it is.
So, I mean, so I was always under the impression that it was a system. And, if you took apart one part of the system, you would have to rearrange the system somehow so that it's most efficient going forward with the new look, however that may be. Is that not correct?
So that's correct. The reason that is the case is because you're relying more on transfers. So you've got two routes, and you want to make sure they have adequate frequency that you can make that transfer easily. So what we've tried to do with these different scenarios of the ATV network is to maintain those core routes where you have transfers as much as possible. So with these cuts, we've basically tried to stay away from those core routes as much as possible. And with the 10% reduction, even with the 10% reduction, we're able to stay away from those core routes as much as possible because of these other reductions that we're talking about.
Okay, that's good. Thank you, Martin.
I can't see the city funding the ATV and a 10% cut for us though, because that would be, I mean, they should that money would then should go to plug the gap, and then they should consider what portion of the ATV, where they want us to, where we can look to increase the frequency. But we would have the structure at least, even if some of the routes wouldn't be at the same frequency that we had envisioned. But is there any further discussion on this, or if not, then I will, we have a motion and a second. So I will go ahead and ask for the vote. All in favor? Say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, that has passed unanimously. Thank you. Get back to the agenda. So Martin, I think you've gone over the ridership reports, which we have in the packet. We've talked about the condo association letter. I know we've talked about some additional surveys that we want. We have the comments. I guess I would just ask, just in the interest of moving this along, if there are questions for Martin on the survey that was done, I think we can entertain those at this time. But I think you've done a very good summary of what the feedback was in the packet. And just noting that this was done in August. So, I mean, it is, at this point, I mean, it is, we're a few months, in terms of just how people are feeling safe, we are a few months removed from when people were answering these questions.
Is there a typo on page 28 where it says, how safe do you think it is to ride public transit right now? Was the second bullet point relatively unsafe or extremely unsafe? Or should that be extremely safe as it is?
Let's see. Sorry, what page was that?
Page 28.
That's a typo.
Okay.
It should, I think that's, extremely unsafe.
Oh yeah, sorry, you're right, that is a typo. Thank you for catching that.
And I'll point out, we can include a distribution of this slide deck will be published. for the public, and we will also go ahead and email this to all board members. There's a few graphs in here that are kind of nice to look at. But to the point of our chairman, in the interest of time, from a staff perspective, we can certainly talk about these at a later date or bring more data back. But I would just say that Martin's team did a fantastic job asking a lot of important questions. So we were just looking to share those with you.
If I could just mention one point that's not listed there, that it's not still on slide, is that the first slide mentions about essential workers. It says 30% of respondents were essential workers. When I did the cross tab of people that are actually riding right now, 50% of the riders right now, based on the survey results, are essential workers. So I just wanted to highlight that.
50% of respondents were essential, said that they were an essential worker.
50% of the respondents that are actually riding right now are essential workers. So really positive there.
Quick question. Are you guys planning to do another survey in August or in the spring or something?
Sorry.
Or are you planning to do another customer survey in the spring or August? We're about to go through winter and, you know, flu season and everything happening. We don't know when the vaccine will be available, and it'll go to, like, you know, healthcare workers first, from my understanding, before it'll go to the main public. So I'm just curious, are you planning to do another customer survey later?
We hadn't discussed it yet, but I think that's a great idea. It's not a big time. It doesn't take a lot of time for us. We've already got the survey instrument designed, so we could just do it again in a couple of months and compare the results.
In my understanding, we're going to have some onboard surveys. Those are to be done before our next meeting, because we have to, specifically on the question of fares, we have to have that data by then.
Oh, okay, thank you.
And will we be asking other questions similar to the survey, or is it just going to be specifically about the fare service trade-off?
Just the fare service trade-off. A very quick survey.
Thank you. All right, we have an executive session for this evening. I did send out an email a few hours before the meeting with a document related to the executive session. Before we go ahead and entertain a motion to enter the executive session, I will announce that our next regular meeting of the Board of Directors will be Wednesday, December 9th at 5:30, and will still be held virtually. I had meant to say this when we had talked about Lisa's departure. And Lisa, we see again tonight how just invaluable you are to us, and we're going to, you know, miss you greatly, and I'm sure you're going to miss us as well. Lisa was in a position that is appointed by the city manager. She's one of the 3 city staff that sits on the board. So the city manager will make an appointment to replace Lisa at some future date. Because the city manager and our charter controls those slots, we will not have a stockholders meeting with council for that appointment. The city manager will simply designate, and that person will begin attending meetings once they are in place. But again, Lisa, we do wish you all the best. With that, Josh, if you want to go ahead and put up the language for the executive session so we can, oh, I see it's already up there. If someone wants to make a motion per what's on the screen.
Mr. Chair, I seem to be accustomed to making this motion in lieu of Member Carrie Donnelly no longer being on here. I, Matt Harris, hereby move that the Alexandria Transit Company Board of Directors convene an executive session for the purpose of discussing legal and personnel matters pursuant to Section 2.2-3711 of the Code of Virginia.
Moved by Matt. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by.
Got a second? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Okay. We're in executive session.
Excuse me, Chairman Kaplan, who seconded that motion?
Steve Kleist seconded. the motion.
Thank you.